In his old life, he shoved a girl out of danger right in front of a speeding truck and paid for it with his own life. Now, as he's reborn, he vows, "This time I'm living the dream popular surrounded by a harem." Bright daylight poured in as two figures stood in a clearing, hemmed in by a thick wall of forest all around. The man slashed his sword and the boy sprang out of the way. Then the kid narrowed his eyes when the man snapped, "So, we're done, is that all you've got?" He said, "It's my turn," then swung his sword with full force. He lunged at the guy, but the guy bared his teeth, snapped out of the way, and swung his sword back, cutting him off mid-attack, leaving the man stunned because the guy had somehow predicted his move. They slammed on the brakes and the man snapped, "I never expected this from you." Then he yanked the young man into a tight hug, smiling through tears, roaring that he'd done an amazing job and that the young man was his son. Rain's cheeks warmed as he gave a shy smile, thanking his father for his words, then shaking his head hard, saying he wasn't ready yet. His father stared at him in stunned disbelief. He insisted it all came down to his father's punch, so brutal and legendary that Rain pictured it tearing the earth open, cracking mountains like they were nothing, just to make sense of what he'd said earlier. Rain's father stared out at the horizon, squinting hard against the sun, while Rain muttered that his old man had zero common sense, and that was the spark behind his bizarre, unbelievable past. He couldn't stop thinking about his father's past, about that dragon-turned demon, the Great Calamity, strong enough to shrug off the power of 3 countries, yet somehow Rain's dad and his 7 friends tore it down by themselves. The book claims they handed him this land as a reward, but he never once spoke about it, and you can bet he had his own reason because both of them are hiding something. Ever since Rain got reincarnated, he's kept it locked in his chest, because the moment he tells his father, everything would blow up in disaster. Rain pulled a hurt, tearful face and thought, "I'm alive, and somehow that's a relief." Life, he clings to a few scraps of memory from his past life, but the rest is a blank void, and his relationships and everyday life, gone completely. But he can still feel his last moments, back to the moment he reached out to that young girl, stunned and terrified by how horrific everything had turned. Rain's mind snapped into full confusion when, out of nowhere, a gorgeous figure materialized right in front of his eyes, and a girl calling his name carefully asked if he was okay. Rain got stopped by May, a maid who caught him off guard. She just smiled like she'd been waiting, then threw her arms around him and confessed. The road's hit by a landslide. She figured something could have happened to him and she'd been assigned to make sure he was safe. She told him he took care of himself, and then her father snapped that being too kind was exactly why they were broke. Then sadness hit him like a truck, all at once. A maid named May leaned in politely and told him to step into her shoes. Then she pulled a heartbreaking face and admitted that as a kid, she had no idea what she was supposed to do. Her father barked her name from across the room, and May the maid spun around ready to blurt out a word, but she hesitated. Rain, the main character, cut in right then and there, calm as ever, smiling like it didn't even bother him, and told her he was happy his father was so good-natured, then thanked everyone for worrying about him. May's father and the maid wrapped Rain up in the tightest hug, bursting into happy tears, and May kept praising him. Then Rain's proud father chimed in, but Rain just wasn't thrilled about that clingy embrace. Once they finally released him, May, the maid, leaned in and warned him that something was waiting right now, and his father snapped, "Waiting for what?" May, the maid, yanked him by the arm and hauled him away, snapping that he had urgent business to handle, and that he needed to come back right now. Meanwhile, his father, eyes brimming with tears and looking downright furious, reached out for his son. Rain, the main guy, yelled at the maid, May, and asked if she had any work for him, and May snapped her gaze over and told him she did, then asked him to help her with his lunch. She grinned and told Rain to pick his favorite mountain vegetables, and Rain couldn't shake the feeling their family was running low on cash. After a while, dark clouds swallowed the sky, and Rain, the main character, sat in a clearing, rummaging through his bag like he was hunting for answers. He promised he'd grab everything when he got home, then started laying out what he planned to do today. He yanked the book out, opened it, and frowned hard. Sure, magic was supposed to work today, but he was hopeless. He let out an awkward laugh because he couldn't make heads or tails of what the book was saying. Even if he grasped the rules, the logic just wouldn't click. He'd heard the wild truth: when you speak the right words, you pull a spirit out of thin air and borrow its element's power. That's what magic is supposed to be, but when Rain tried it, nothing answered. Then he remembered the time he'd tried to set a tiny log on fire, and it wouldn't even blink. Rain tried to spark a fire by himself, convinced you can't just conjure flames out of thin air. Behind him, the bushes suddenly erupted with strange sounds, and Rain, right then, felt a wave of fear hit, wary and on guard. Rain snapped his head toward the noise, and his surprise hit hard. A boar was there, just a wild one at first, until he spotted a tiny horn on its forehead, and his mind immediately screamed, "That's a magic stone." Just as Rain stepped forward, a boar charged in, then the truth hit. It wasn't ordinary at all, it was a demonic one. In this world, those strange stones latch onto animals and twist them into raging demons, and Rain, our main character, has heard rumor after rumor about cattle turning into demons and wiping out entire cities. A wild boar planted itself right in front of Rain, and he swore to himself he'd hunted plenty of boars before. But today, he only had a wooden sword, a thick book, and a bento in his hands, and when he stared at it all, dread hit him like, "This is it. These are the last minutes of my life." The boar slammed his hooves into the ground, churned up dirt, and braced to strike, while Rain, clutching his sword, frowned hard, convinced he was the hero's son and couldn't even think about running. The boar barreled straight at the main character, Rain, and the young man snapped his teeth in a snarl. Then the boar slammed its muzzle into the ground, and Rain got shoved sideways, thinking it couldn't possibly get any worse. The boar tore into his bento, and Rain, the protagonist, stared at him with a heavy, sad face, panicking because he knew he was in serious trouble. If only he could use magic right now. Rain cracked open the book and muttered, "All or nothing." He started to read about God's wrath exploding in the storm clouds, his fury, the mighty enemy ahead, then a blue blade cleaved through the dark, but after that everything blurred and the boar kept closing in on him. Then, with no warning, a thunderous roar ripped through the air behind Rain. He jerked around, eyes wide with fear, a messy mix of confusion and doubt flashing across his face as he wondered if he was really trying to cast a spell or if he'd actually learned magic for real. Rain snapped his gaze upward, stunned by the blazing sunshine, and said, "Yeah, just like I figured, this isn't my magic, but it's not exactly magic either." He shot his hand out, claiming it was brutally hard to wipe out a demonic boar in one swing, and then demanded to see what kind of light this even was. Rain, our main character, snatched a touch from beyond this light, jerked his hands back so fast it stung, and shouted in loud, shaking fear, "What kind of slime is that?" He gaped in disbelief as a young girl stepped out with no clothes on, wrapped him in a sweet, tender hug, and stunned him by saying she'd finally found him. A creepy sound snapped the air, and Rain, the main character, crumpled to the ground as that girl grabbed him. His cheeks flared bright red. He bolted upright, yelled at her with pure indignation, and demanded who she was, then shot back that he was Rain Curtis, the son of Lord Religious. Rain, the main character, thought Marina probably just didn't get him, until the girl shot him a sharp, indignant look and said her name was Marina. She flushed bright, then looked him dead in the eyes and whispered, trembling with seriousness, that he'd given his life for her. Rain's world jolted, he couldn't believe it, and the girl standing there looked exactly like the one from his last memory in his past life. The girl spun away from him and vowed to repay every last bit. Then Rain, the protagonist, suddenly started bleeding from his nose. She slid between his legs, pressed right against him, and guided his hand onto hers, bare skin under the air, and Rain froze, cheeks flushing as he blurted, "That's dangerous, but it feels so damn nice." She blushed hard and let out a shaky sigh. Then, before long, she dropped to all fours and boldly shouted that she wanted him. Rain, the main guy, watched her with a smirk and realized this wasn't something any teenager should be able to hold back. After Rain finally came back to the clearing, loud noises erupted in the air. Then he announced, "I'm back," and May, the maid, rushed up to greet him. Maid May fidgeted and swore she'd told him to grab mountain vegetables, then leaned toward the protagonist like, "Tell me, does this look like mountain vegetables to you?" She jabbed her finger straight at Marina, there beside Rain, clinging to his arm like she owned the moment. The maid Me stammered nervously that these were mountain vegetables, big, lush, and full of life, until Rain snapped at her in disgust, screaming that she was dead wrong. Her father clapped a hand onto Marina's shoulder and frowned hard, admitting he finally saw that Rain, the main character he'd set his sights on, had delivered what he asked for tonight. His side dish, or maybe the fuel for his ideas, and Marina blushed as she shyly covered herself with her hand. Maid May drove a brutal punch into Rain's father, and the old man crumpled as Rain hit the floor, tears spilling like he couldn't breathe. Then the stage finally lit up for his wild, popular harem life. Marina struck a super cute pose, then rumbled a low growl in a soft voice, and later the next morning birds outside the window chirped from a tree right beside it. Rain was still sprawled in bed moaning softly under the blanket, then he blinked and muttered, "It's already morning." He cracked his eyes open, expecting the usual chill, but today the warmth felt way too strong for some reason. Just as he thought he'd found even a little comfort, he looked up, and there was Marina, a girl watching him from beneath the blanket with a sweet, warm look. She grinned and greeted him with a warm good morning, then leaned in and tried to steal a kiss, and Rain's cheeks flushed as he gasped, utterly stunned. Marina told her that he looked like he was having the time of his life, and that's when she straightened up and jumped in to help. Marina kept touching herself, urging him on, and Rain snapped, furious that he couldn't take it, demanding she stop. Right behind Marina, a maid named May suddenly appeared, creeping up with silent hands and drawing her into a chilling embrace. Then she hissed that she understood everything and promised this cat would stop breathing for good before lifting her up in her arms. The maid May yanked her away from Rain, the main guy. Then Marina lunged forward, grabbed his attention, and blurted that their relationship was exposed. Before he could even breathe, she said she'd end her life and begged him to help. Rain just froze, stunned by every word. He stared at the maid May with a crushed look and asked, hopeful as anything, whether she was dead serious. Me the maid hissed to a stop, waved Marina off, and warned her with a stern look not to be so careless. Now she had to get dressed, and Marina snapped back that she didn't have a single piece of clothing. May the maid let out a tired sigh and shot a little displeased look, then marched to the curtains and asked if she could borrow one pair. Rain blinked in shock and said, "Sure, but what are you planning to do with them?" Maid Me, hands moving like they'd done it 1,000 times, started wrapping Marina in the curtains they'd just taken down, pressing them over her hips and shoulders, tugging them into place with skillful little knots, and then grinning as she declared, "All set." Marina strutted in a stunning light dress stitched from curtains, grinning and calling it perfect. Then Rain snapped, "Add another bow," and May the maid nodded like a pro, whipped out a fresh bow and pinned it right into her hair. Rain, yes, that Rain laughed and called herself so cute, and Marina immediately flushed, staring at him with a tiny, shy smile. Marina thanked him, then let her dress slide down as she purred, "I'll thank you with my body," and the maid May snapped with rage, saying she'd had enough. The father peeked into the room and asked if he could come in now, and May, the maid, stared at him with guilt, admitted she'd already forgotten him, then let him in and blurted out an apology for making him wait. The father yanked a chair out and dropped into it, telling Marina he needed to ask her something. Then he clasped his fingers by his face, hooked his chin, leaned his elbows on the table and demanded, "Who are you?" With a threatening glare, while May the maid stood beside him with her hands tucked behind her back. Rain and May stood before their father like two kids caught red-handed, all stiff and scared. Then Marina stepped forward and said only Rain had ever shown her kindness, the one small light she'd been begging for while she'd been alone for so long. Rain's eyes lit up when Marina told him she'd always wanted to thank him for what he did for her once. She laid her palm on his chest and told him softly but surely that she'd come all this way for one reason, because his life had ended. Then father, totally out of the blue, shot up from his seat, shouting that this couldn't be real, and everyone was forced to watch as he declared it was the magic of reincarnation. Rain's father scowled and stared him down like a warning sign, then demanded, sharply, whether Rain had some wild, incredible gift for magic, acting like it was the most amazing thing in the world. Rain stood there, visibly thrown off by how this got so intense so fast. Rain's hands shook as he fought to get the words out. Then his father just mumbled, swore everything was fine, and admitted he had no clue. The father lifted a finger and promised that the magic of reincarnation could flip his whole life, and Rain, our main guy, just let out a deep sigh, then admitted it was actually pretty cool. May, the maid, grabbed his attention and demanded what he planned to do with her, while father pulled Marina into a loving hug, tears streaming down his face, heartbreak written all over him as he admitted they wouldn't be able to feed anyone else. Her father finally nodded and sent her off, then leaned in close, voice deadly serious, and asked if she had somewhere safe to stay. Marina flashed a soft, mysterious smile, took Rain's hand in hers and pressed herself close as if to say, "This is where you belong, Rain." Marina inched closer until her lips touched Rain, whispering, "I love you," while the father let out a shaky laugh, muttering that Rain's the one who's supposed to be here, and May, the maid, snapped back that it was pointless. Maid May called out to Marina, and when Marina spun around, May offered her the job, saying Rain would be the one to hire her as her employer. So Marina stared at Rain and asked, straight up, if he could handle it. Marina shot him a confident smirk, giggled, and said she'd try to serve Rain, then fully expected that doing so would earn her the key to his room. Their father barely glanced at them before smirking and saying, "All right, off to the mountains you go, and I'll show you exactly what my magic can do." After a while they burst into a clearing, birds wheeling overhead like the sky was cheering them on. The father snapped, "All right, time to start," and asked what kind of magic Marina could unleash. Marina locked eyes with Rain's father and blurted out that she couldn't use magic, leaving him staring at her in disbelief as he demanded, "Did you just try reincarnation magic?" Rain pulled a pitiful face and blurted that he couldn't do it either, until Marina gently patted his head to calm him down, and his father just stared and said there was nothing to be done, so today they'd start a special magic lesson. "Father told me magic is just imagination made real, but trying to picture something truly powerful is brutally hard, so they crank out poems tied to each element to give that power a voice, and that's the whole secret behind speaking magic." He broke it down. There were 7 elements altogether, and once you drill the one you can visualize the easiest, you're learning rockets. Marina and Rain stared at him, confused and stubbornly asking again about the performance and its elements, while their father just froze in a small daze, then muttered that maybe it'd be better if he showed them himself. "Father told me to blend my magic power using both hands, so I snapped my palms close and a flame burst into existence between them. He said to picture the magic shape while I spoke, then cast it, and with that he blasted the fire straight at the forest. A blast tore through everything, so massive it might as well have been nuclear, obliterating the hill almost completely, and father just stared in shock, muttering that this had to be happening somehow, even though he hadn't lifted a finger. He whined that he couldn't believe it. Somehow the power was still insanely huge, and the girl Marina patted him on the head like, "Keep your chin up," while Rain stared at them, sweating over one terrifying thought. If he actually invested, the whole world would end. After a while the father leaned in and told them, "All right, now it's your turn. First, you'll learn to mix your magical power, and if you train for 6 months it'll finally start to take shape." Marina inched her palms toward each other, and after a breath a shard of crystal bloomed between them. Calm as ever, she said everything was set, then snapped the air like it was ice and froze the water mid-air. Her father froze in shock and blurted, "This is incredible," while Riene, the main character, was clearly struggling, and he still insisted she was even more talented than he'd ever guessed. Then he froze in place and said something was off with Marina. Snowbanks piled all around her, and her father stared at her, fear creeping into his face. He snapped at Marina, yelling that the magic power had gone out of control and she needed to calm down fast. Then he urged her to steady her mind, just as his own feet started to freeze solid. Then the father's whole body froze solid, ice crawling up to his neck, and Rain, shouting his name with pure panic, heard him say only Rain could save him now. Rain stared back, trembling with worry. His father stared him down and ordered him to mix his magic with another element so they could cancel each other out. Then he stood there, jaw set, saying he'd pull it off and placing his whole trust in him. Ice just kept piling up, and Rain stared at it, panic punching through his chest, thinking, "If I don't act right now, my father will take his own life." He snapped his gaze to Marina, desperate to figure out how she pulled off ice magic. He knit his brows, and the young man snapped to attention. If she could freeze water in midair, then she'd have to counter it with something else. Then, out of nowhere, a voice shouted his name. Marina seized the moment and told him to bolt, "Get out of there now." Rain clutched his stomach, yelling that he wasn't running away, he just wouldn't back down like this. Then he spun his back to her, swore he'd saved her in their past life, and promised he'd protect her again and again, as many times as it took. A swarm of ice crystals barreled toward him. Rain, aka the protagonist, snapped his frown tight and slid his palms closer, shouting "Pierce" like a command, then thrust his hand forward and an electric web erupted around him, crackling into pure static lightning. Rain wheezed for breath as tiny lightning bolts still crawled down his arm, then he snapped to a stop in shock, because he could. Their father burst in, wrapped his arms around Rain and Marina, and boomed that Rain was such a good boy. Then Rain grinned and said he was just relieved to be okay. Their father finally waved them off, then admitted he didn't believe he had the power for magic at all, much less to unlock that hard-to-read, insanely complex element called lightning. Rain pulled Marina into a tight hug, thanked her through the moment, and told her it was all because of the push she gave him. Marina didn't answer, not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Then the young guy called her, and just like that she crumpled to the ground. Rain, the main character, snapped into action, scooped her up, and hurriedly demanded if she was okay. Marina wiped tears from her eyes and confessed she had an incurable disease, one that could never be cured. Rain frowned, shocked, and demanded to know what it was and how it suddenly showed up. She plopped onto his lap and tugged her top just a bit, then whispered that the disease is in Rhine and that it's her absolute favorite. Both of them flushed red, and Rhine nearly choked on a mix of shock and embarrassment. Marina met Rain's gaze with hope burning in her eyes, insisting only he could cure her. So Rain snapped, fear and fury flashing across his face, and instantly threw himself between her and the danger, covering her with his hand, leaving Marina stunned as he admitted he never thought he'd be able to help at all. Marina stared at his hand, grabbed it, and announced she was scrapping the old plan. Now she'd cure Rain for real, then started licking Rain's finger. Rain, staring at Marina in pure shock, blurted, "What the hell is this?" because he instantly sensed it was deadly dangerous. Marina was already smudging her lips with 2 fingers when she shot him a question, "Have your wounds healed yet?" Rain, awkward as ever, muttered, "That's really nice," then shut one eye, stared at Marina, and realized his friend wasn't holding back anymore. Marina kept licking his fingers, then snapped her gaze away, tilted her head, and calling him Pow Pow Sama, asked if he wanted her to take care of him too. Rain's voice cracked with worry as he blurted, "Stop," because his father was right there. Marina, all understanding eyes, leaned in and told him, "If it's you, then everything's perfect." She flashed a magical letter, and when Rain finally saw it, he went completely stunned. A letter came from her father saying he finally got what was happening, so he headed home first and telling Rain to stop worrying because everything would be fine. He also told May, "We're staying out all night," then added he couldn't wait to see his grandchildren, and Rain was left completely stunned. Marina practically begged him to pour out every last ounce of his energy on her, and Rain shot back, furious that no magic is born from that, so Rain ended up learning magic for real. Marina started squirming her curves again, noticed Rain reaching for something, and guessed he was trying to crawl away, so she yanked him in a tighter choke. Rain trembled, but he didn't dare answer her. Marina strutted up to Rain and demanded his thoughts, then threw her arms around him and clung tight like she wouldn't let go, only for Rain to frown and mutter that he was basically finished. Then he grinned in pure triumph and shouted that he'd done it, right as a blazing flame flickered to life between his palms. Marina gave a small, radiant smile and blurted that it was just unbelievable. Then her father, eyes glassy with tears, crushed the young man in a tight hug and beamed, "This is exactly what I knew my son would do." After a while, they burst into a clearing, and the father grinned, saying both of them were leveling up in magic in ways that were truly unbelievable. Rain, the main character, shot him a grateful thank you on the spot. Rain stared at Marina, the magic prodigy, and then snapped that he wasn't even close to her, like he had zero chance against her. The father leaned in to hype his son, telling Rain that swinging a sword is his turf, and that another duel is coming for them real soon. Suddenly May the maid burst out from behind, sprinting straight toward her father, shouting Rain's name at the top of her lungs. He spun toward her and demanded what was wrong and why they'd have no side dish for dinner again. May the maid shot back in furious anger, "No." May the maid trembled and blurted that a deadly epidemic had erupted across the village right in their territory, and the first symptoms had already started showing up. Her father froze at the news, suddenly on edge. May the maid shut her eyes and told them, according to the report, after the victim got slammed with diarrhea and vomiting that looked like white water, their body would freeze and dry out completely, and it was a disease that would kill them within just a few days. Father stared him down and demanded answers about the healer, Lelina. The maid May admitted she'd already sent for her, but Lelina wasn't coming anytime soon. With that, Rain couldn't help but start guessing what would happen next to the villagers. Marina yanked at his clothes. Rain turned to her and she murmured something close to his ear. His face pinched into a frown as he said, dead serious, "I get it." Rain planted his hand over his chest, stood tall, and shouted at his father that he finally knew what kind of disease it was, and maybe, just maybe, they could save everyone in this town. The father stared in stunned disbelief, demanding, "So, how are we even going to pull this off?" Rain shot a serious look around and demanded to know if there was any place nearby piled with salt. A maid named May snapped that now wasn't the moment to argue about salt, but her father swung a hand up in front of her and ordered her to stop. Eventually, the father caved in to Rain's idea and told them there were salt deposits to the west, plus, a cart would take about 10 days to haul it over. Then he stared them down and asked, "So how are you getting it there without a cart?" Marina tucked her hands behind her back and Rain, standing tall, said with total confidence, "We won't need you, we'll use something else instead." Marina snatched apples from the barrels, balanced them on her head, and clutched the rest in her hands. Then Rain, our main character, sat down and showed off her skills to her father and May, the maid. Her father stared at them baffled and called it a killer trick, then demanded, "So how are you even delivering the salt with this?" Marina snapped back, "It's not magic," and took a bite of the apple. She started chewing, swallowed, and blurted out that this was a magical storage, and that it was the easiest way to deliver salt, even if the words came out a bit messy. Father stared at her and demanded she say something he could actually understand. Rain leaned in and told everyone about Marina's magical storage. Use it to ship mountains of salt with zero hassle, toss in water or huge items, keep the food from spoiling, and forget about carts forever. Rain's father snapped the question, how were they getting there if they were just running? Rain let out a small, unsure smile and said, "If I'm with you, Dad, we'd be faster on foot, but Marina's with me, so I'll use something." Then Rain lifted it up. Rain told his father and May the maid they'd soar on a shield powered by the wind, while Marina already hung in the air on that shield like it was totally normal, munching an apple, until the father stared and snapped, "I don't think that shield flight thing is even possible." Rain slapped a finger to his lips and whispered that he was planning to earn salt money by taking a guild quest near the deposits. Just then, the maid May scooped up Marina and snapped at her to stop being so reckless, and Marina only whimpered through the pain. May, the maid, gave Marina a tight hold, flashed a small smile, and promised she'd take a job to end someone's life, though she warned it could get deadly. Without warning, her father slammed the decision into the room and yelled that it was final. Then he swung his hand outward, called Rain and Marina over, and demanded they show him how they handle a problem this serious. Rain nodded in agreement and Marina kept chewing her apple like it was nothing, then told them, "Leave it to us." A blue sky stretched overhead as fluffy clouds drifted by, then Rain cradled Marina in his arms and declared, "We're leaving, right now." Her father just stared, saying he was counting on them. Rain planted himself on a shield atop a freezing hill, climbed toward the sky, then he leaned in and asked, "Marina, you ready?" And she shot back, "Yeah." Rain bared his teeth with raw tension, then sprinted forward and straight up, arms tight around Marina as she wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her head there like it was home. The maid, May, and the father just watched as they stormed off, and May blurted out that she could only pray everything would be okay, while the father squinted into the sun, shielding his face, and muttered that all they really had left was hope. Her long hair and the cape draped over her father's shoulders snapped and fluttered in the wind as he told her it was growing faster than she'd ever dare to imagine. May, the maid, marched up to her father and said, "We should head to the village instead of just standing here in this clearing." Her father nodded right away and told her they had to make a backup plan just in case. After a while, Rain and Marina found themselves on a beach and a lazy cat sprawled on a rock, yawning like it owned the place. Rain stared around and said the clues fit. This assassination job had to be happening right around here. Marina nodded, fully on board. Rain scratched his head and said, "Man, it's crazy peaceful here," while Marina scooped up the cat and stroked him. Then Rain looked at Marina and asked, "So, who are we dealing with?" The mission brief warned that beach invaders were planting nests along the west coast and stirring up chaos, so Rain had to stop them and protect the salt fields. Only problem was, Rain had no clue what beach invaders or nests even meant. Rain and the cat trailed the shoreline as waves crashed around them, and when the main character finally called out, he said, "If these are only crows, I've got it, Marina, save your magic for the trip back," and Marina nodded right away, saying she understood. Rain and the kitten peered into a hole, and when he saw how many holes riddled the place, he snapped, wide-eyed, to the young girl, "Could these be nests?" Then he spotted something lurking deep inside. Out of the hole, massive tentacles slithered into view, and Rain and his girlfriend Marina froze in pure terror. Then they hit the ground, while the cat with bristled fur stared them down like it wanted a fight. Rain swore these weren't crows for a second, then he stared at the tentacles with pure dread, brow knitted tight. The beach squid burst out of the hole like it had been waiting to pounce. Rain shrieked like it was a squid, lunged for the sword tucked at his chest, and shouted to Marina to get behind him. Marina just nodded with zero panic. The squid stared them down, then threw its mouth open and blasted a spray of ink right in their faces. Rain figured he could just dodge his way out, until it hit him that Marina was right behind him and he snapped around with pure fear on his face. Marina hauled together a shelter of ice, and when the ink splashed inside, she and her cat finally found safety. Rain let out a breath of relief, flashed a confident smile, and told him she was a true magic expert, so yeah, he didn't have to protect her. Marina still heard Rain's vow he'd protect her as many times as it took, and she burst out of the shelter, marching straight toward the squid. Rain stared at her in shock, calling her name, confused about what she was doing, but then the squid snapped a tentacle around her wrist. The squid yanked Marina by her arms and legs, then cinched her up tight with its tentacles. Marina kept her face calm and looked straight at Rain, begging him to save her. Rain shot back, furious and terrified, demanding why she'd ended up there in the first place. Marina, unnervingly calm and emotionless, told Rain, the main character, to protect her, and Rain's rage flared as he glared at her, demanding what the heck she meant. 4 beach squids were already lined up ahead of Rain, and Marina snapped that it was all because Rain, strong as hell, could overpower them while she was the weak one. A squid yanked the straps off her shoulders with a tentacle, then snapped her dress loose with a quick twist. Marina froze, utterly stunned. Squid ripped off her curtain dress as Marina demanded, "Stop." Rain saw this, froze with pure fear at the sudden shock of it, and his mind kept screaming, "Why is he stripping her?" while Marina stood there blushing hard. Rain shot a sinister glare at the scene, his gut twisting as he wondered if Marina was about to get hurt, while the squid clamped down on her legs and arms and then wrapped its tentacles around her whole body. Rain flashed a grin and immediately decided he had to help her, then Marina opened her mouth. Rain's cheeks burned as he stared at Marina, barely clothed, then he froze, terrified that one wrong move could hurt her, so he inched closer, watching every detail. Rain stared as a squid wrapped around her curves, then swept over her hips, crawling toward her on whipping tentacles, and Rain tried to cover his freeze by claiming he was just assessing the situation. Rain suddenly started spurting blood from his nose, he didn't even know why, while he just stared at Marina. She called him over and asked if he was really the kind who liked this, then bit the tip right off the tentacle hanging in her mouth. Rain shot a glance away, cheeks burning, and blurted, "Of course it's not like that." He yanked his hands up like he'd been caught, mouth hanging open, insisting it wasn't true, because he was just trying to assess the situation to help her. The squid yanked Marina toward him and snapped his beak open. Then Marina, calm as ever, said, "If you want to save me, move now or I'm about to get eat." Marina shot Rain a grin, and Rain, wary and shaking with fear, couldn't stop bracing for what was about to happen right in front of him. He yanked his sword up in one sharp motion and sliced the squid into pieces, then dropped to the ground with a deadly glare, clutching Marina in his arms. Rain declared, loud and clear, that he wouldn't hand her over to anyone. He smirked as Marina cradled her protector gently by the neck. After what felt like forever, Marina finally knotted the last string on her dress, then she and her sat on the beach, while Marina apologized to the Rain for messing up. She shot Rain a guilty look, then confessed it was all on her, she'd caused him nothing but trouble. Rain flashed a small smile, went bright red, and snapped back that it wasn't true, that it was his fault he didn't reach her sooner. Marina pushed up from her seat, told Rain everything was fine, and promised she'd be more careful next time, then Rain flashed her a warm, trusting smile. A second later, the squid snatched her again and yanked her straight into the water, and Marina, hope blazing in her eyes, reached for the young guy, but Rain, the main character, froze in stunned silence, clueless what to do next. The squid ripped off her clothes again, and Marina's mouth fell open as pure terror hit her. Rain desperately shouted her own name, and while birds wheeled overhead, Marina stayed icy calm and asked him for help. Now they had trouble crawling toward them. Just a week later, the village street was packed with barrels of medicine, and the disease finally backed off from the villagers, exactly what the hero's son had promised, but not a single person saw him that morning. Strangers passing by stared in shock and a bit of anger, seeing Rain and his girlfriend Marina sprawled under a tree, completely wiped out, while Rain's mind finally snapped after he'd been battling the disease for so long. Their rule looked drained and worn out, like exhaustion had swallowed everything, and then they clocked the truth: dehydration was what killed infected people. So they didn't overthink it, they just had to moisturize, pure and simple. That's why they hauled in salt and whipped up a saline solution made by stirring salt into water. It buys them a little time, but the sickness still claws at them, and they're running out of salt, and with it, their strength. Maid May hovered behind the counter, shoulders hunched, fighting a sharp, brutal pain that stabbed through her back. After a while, Marina finally snapped and asked, "Rain, are you okay?" While she stayed down on all fours, trembling hard from head to toe, Rain, worn out and dead tired, looked up and shot back, "What about me?" Marino crumpled onto her side, gasping that she wasn't okay, and Rain snapped his eyes shut, because yeah, that checked out, she'd been hauling out water with magic for ages. The young man snapped his jacket shut, and Marina shot him a look, telling him straight up that if she didn't flirt with Rain right now, she'd be dead. Rain, trapped and unable to move, could only helplessly blurt, "What is it?" And Marina admitted she'd been hoping for this. Rain, the main character, reluctantly crawled up to Marina and grudgingly agreed. Marina snapped her eyes open and met Rain's gaze, and he scooped her up with fierce tenderness, hugging her tight to his chest while his back braced against a tree. Then he leaned in and asked her if this was exactly what she wanted. Marina grinned sweetly, wrapped her arms around him and pressed herself hard to his chest, whispering that Rain is warm. Then Rain's cheeks flared red as he looked away, insisting she shouldn't hold him that tight. Rain shot his hand into a deadly place between her thighs, and the young girl's clothes slid off her chest. He snapped his head up and shouted Marina's name, but she didn't answer, so he yelled again, and still she stayed in his arms, sitting there with her eyes closed. Rain stared at her like, "Did you pass out?" Maybe she was just wiped out, while his own eyelids drooped, and even he felt that heavy, drowsy pull coming on. Sunbeams sliced through the branches, and there, between the leaves, glimmered the outline of a man with elf ears. Rain just smiled at the glowing light for a second, then spotted those ears and took notice. Right in front of him, an elf girl with jaw-dropping ears reached out for Rain, trying to kiss him. Then a brutal scream tore through the air, and she crashed hard onto the ground. Rain trudged forward, then his father tailed him and blurted, "What happened?" Rain snapped his head back, rage blazing in his eyes. He clamped down on the elf hard, claiming he'd finally caught a suspicious intruder, while the girl shook with fear and screamed at him to let her go. Rain's father stared at him, totally baffled, and demanded answers again about that sketchy stranger. So Rain shot back that he'd been posted under a tree when a mysterious lady burst out of the bushes and came for him, nearly attacking him on the spot. May, the maid, scooped Marina into her arms, and Marina just let her hands dangle. Then May turned to Rain and demanded, "So, is she the one behind all this?" Rain glanced at May, smiled through a little nerves, and answered, "Nah, she doesn't look like it." The elf girl fixed Rain with a stern, indignant stare, told the young man it was all a misunderstanding, and demanded he listen, right now. Dad's face tightened as he snapped, "Why?" Then she climbed up to him and whispered, "Lilina." Rain, loud, furious, ordered her to confess while keeping hold of her, but right after that, Rain froze mid-sentence and just stared, completely stunned. Rain's brow knitted in disbelief as he blurted out that none of this could be real. Then he spun to his father and demanded, shaking, "You named her Lilina." His voice cracked as he stared, stunned at the possibility of the legendary healer Lilina-san, and in the next breath he pictured her face like it was right in front of him. Lilina shot the Rain a look and smirked at the protagonist like, "That's why I told you to listen." Then she leaned back, eyes locked in, and teased him, "So, does this pose embarrass you?" with her legs spread wide as she sat there. Rain, face blazing, finally let Lilina go and blurted out an apology, while Lilina fussed with her dress, glaring like she wasn't impressed. Then her father studied her closely and said he was just glad she'd come. Lilina rose to her feet and told the protagonist's father that she and Religus hadn't crossed paths in ages, since the day the demonic dragon was finally defeated. The father smiled and admitted it, yeah, it was real because he'd been saved by her. Rain shot them a startled look, convinced she was the one who saved his father and that she had to be an incredible magician. Lilina gave a small, slightly awkward smile and said it still feels like nostalgia. Lilina replayed it all in her head, lifted a finger and smiled, till she admitted the truth. Her magic kept crushing and rebuilding shattered organs, stitching torn limbs back together again and again, and for the first time fear hit her hard that it might finally run dry. Lilina flicked her hand like it was nothing, laughing at how half his head got ripped off. Then father grinned and said he'd felt something totally brand new. Off in the distance, Rain watched them and muttered that the 7 heroes were insanely dangerous. Rain, our protagonist, blurts out, "Why did you try to kiss me, Lilina?" And Lilina stares at him, cheeks flaming, admitting he'd completely misunderstood. She tried to tell them, "You see it too, right?" Because he looked like his mana was about to run dry, so she was just trying to warn him and share what she noticed. She fidgeted, clutched her chest with trembling hands, and flat out told him she wasn't interested. Her father stood right behind her, swallowed his pride, and apologized for pulling her attention away. Then he said it was time to go heal the villagers. Lena snapped back into herself, wearing a calm, locked-in expression as the memory hit. She swung her hand up and started chanting, summoning the wind that once swore an oath with her to steer the forest's healing power straight into those ravaged by the disease. Then she shut her eyes tight and choked into the next cough as her chant pushed on. Lilina dropped into a squat, and right in that instant tears flooded her eyes. She clapped a hand over her mouth, stammering in shock as she realized she'd messed up, biting her tongue to stop herself. Her father, visibly disappointed, dragged a hand over his forehead. Her father stared at her like a threat and snapped that he'd never believed she couldn't cast magic without saying the right words, while Rain, the main character, gave a shaky little smile and Lilina cut in, saying it wasn't really like that. Lelina Sama, one of the 7 heroes, stands there looking majestic and stunning, and her spellwork sings through the air like a sweet, chirping bird. Lilina awkwardly huddled her arms across her stomach, trying to hide herself, and admitted that since the whole tavern wouldn't stop talking, she started casting spells just to keep her image intact. She shot up a finger and summoned the magic ball like it was nothing, then admitted it took time to get used to. Then she shouted "Cure," and the damage vanished into a full recovery. Magical force crashed over the village like a living storm. Flower petals whirled through the air, and past them the village buildings came into view. So Rain lifted his hand to chest height, eyes locked on the fluttering petals, and realized this was the peak of healing magic. Everyone finally exhaled, everything felt like it would be okay now, and Lilina even admitted she'd heard the disease was a curse, but somehow, it barely even hurt. Rain's father declared it was all thanks to the medicine Rain brewed, that this moment was exactly what his son was meant to do, while Rain stepped aside. Lilina rested her hand on his shoulder and praised him like only religious son could deliver. Then Rain gave a shaky, nervous little smile. Right after that, she snapped still, stared at her father in stunned silence, then blurted, "Wait, are you really my father's son?" Rain, the main character, clutched his arms to his sides and awkwardly answered, "Yeah, I'm his son." Her father shot a shocked question like, "Didn't I ever tell you?" Lilina planted her hands on her hips, steaming, saying he'd never mentioned it, let alone that he was married. Rain, the main character, glared at her, anger flickering in his eyes. Lilina stared at Rain first, then snapped her gaze to his father, and the moment she did, it hit her. The eyes weren't alike, the nose didn't match, and even their faces didn't line up. She wondered if he'd inherited that face from his mom, and the thought hit her like a wave of sadness. The kids swarmed around the protagonist's rule, and he laughed with them, smiling as they praised him and thanked him for the medicine. So Lilina guessed it was a little too good to be true, yet she still couldn't shake that strange, heavy feeling in the air. Lilina gently brushed Rain's head, smiled so warmly it felt like sunlight, and told him he looked just like religious. Then Rain snapped in shock, asking her if it was really true. They watched his father laughing and playing with the kids, and Lilina snapped that he'd always been reckless, throwing himself at everyone else's problems until he stayed broke, unable to use healing magic at all, and that's why fear wouldn't leave her face. Rain stared at Lilin and blurted out what he'd do if he could use healing magic, but he couldn't get the words out. Lilin lunged in and hugged him, and as his face vanished in her curves, a scorching blush exploded across his cheeks. Lilina slipped in close, hugged the main character tight, and pressed him to her chest, then beamed and said, "Like father, like son, we're both just good-natured people." Lilina pressed a gentle hand to his head and told Rain she'd teach him healing magic later. Right now, he had to rest. Rain shot her a sharp thank you and raised his hand high. He yanked her by the clothes, and Lilina's cheeks flared as she shot him an indignant look. Rain yanked the clothes off her chest, pressed himself against her like it was nothing, then slammed her to the ground right as she screamed. Her legs shot upward and her dress rode up with them, so the fabric nearly grazed her face, until she shot him a worldly look and demanded he stop treating her like she was just another one of the 7 heroes, the same heroes her father stared at them in shock. Lilina snapped her eyes shut while Rain clamped her in place, and she warned that his image would be wrecked. Yet Rain just smiled, calm as victory, and thanks to Rain and everyone who fought with him, the village was finally saved. After a while, Marina stepped outside to hang laundry on the line, and Rien, staring out the window with his mouth hanging open, said, "This morning feels so peaceful." Out of nowhere, he spotted someone deep in the forest and snapped into full alert. his mind racing over who it could be. He called Marina and told her someone was lurking in the forest. She had to go check it. Marina stared at him, then flicked her hand and waved him through, shattering a path of icy crystals. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the forest. Rain jolted, snatched his jacket on fast, and blurted his thanks to Marina, and she just stared on, calm as anything, waving him off like everything was totally fine. Rain spotted Elena crouched by a tree, terror written all over her face, and when she kicked her leg up, her dress flared, sharp crystals punched into the bark on both sides, then she snapped one with her teeth like it was nothing. Lilina blurted out, furious and shaking, begging them never to pull that stunt again. Then she demanded, "Do you think it's dangerous?" Rain, the protagonist, snapped, apologized fast, and admitted he'd mistaken her for a suspicious stranger. Lilina demanded to know if his dad and the maid were here, and Rain, steady as ever, told her they were still cleaning up the village, so he hadn't made it back yet. Lilina broke free from the ice crystals with a smirk like she'd been waiting for this and said that this was exactly why she came. She wanted to meet his wife, or, to be precise, his mother. Rain started talking about his mother with a heavy sadness in his voice, then a small smile tugged at his face when the memories hit, only to snap back and say, "That person doesn't exist here," because he'd been abandoned as a child. Lilina froze in shock, blurting that if it were a cat or a dog she'd scoop it up in a heartbeat, but a child, no way, not her. She told him that in that case she was certain he'd been picked up on a rainy day, and then Rain, the main character, blurted out in shock, "Why do you think that?" Lilina wore a sly grin and said the first thing that popped into her head was his gear, because the name spells it out. Rain, and he swings a fiery wind sword that slices through the air like a blazing windshield. She pressed a finger to her lips, thinking hard, and said the lack of blood ties meant his magic and sword skills came from training, so maybe, just maybe, he could learn it too. Rain's eyes widened as she blurted, "Wait, what do you mean by learn?" Lilina shot up a finger, conjured a blazing magic ball, and told him it was healing magic, then pressed, "Did you promise you'd teach me?" Rain shot a message to Marina, offering to team up and train together, then Marina blinked in shock and asked the young guy, "Can I really?" Lilina ruffled her head and told her, "Easy, I've got this," then leaned in with a grin and said she'd heard Marina could actually use magic, so they'd take turns learning from her. Polina scooted a little closer, grabbed Rain's attention and told him, "Hold your hand out in front of you." He did straight up in position and asked, "Is this right?" Polina smiled and said, "Perfect, everything's fine." She demanded, "Take this and bite down hard." Rain, our main character, snatched the tiny piece of wood between his teeth and stared at Lilin, utterly baffled. Suddenly, she lunged with a dagger and a menacing stare, and Rain's heart kicked, until he snapped his hand around the blade, yanking it away and saving himself from getting cut. Lilina stared him down and snapped that if he even tried to defend himself, nothing would go right, and he wouldn't heal unless he took damage first. The protagonist swallowed hard, frowned, and told her to wait a second. He flashed a shaky grin and demanded to know why nobody could use his finger. Then Lilina snapped, annoyed, and told him, "Let me explain the words of a certain sage." She repeated it word for word, "Stab yourself with a knife and you'll be handed healing power." Rain's smile flickered with nerves, and he muttered that lines like this would totally come from some old-school reincarnator, just to set the mood. Lilina snapped her dagger back into motion and declared it had just opened. Rain sized him up warily, but Lilina snapped a dagger into his palm, flashed a satisfied grin, and when he yelped and grabbed his wrist, she just stood there like it was all part of the plan. Marina called out to Rain, worry blazing in her voice, and Rain dropped to the ground as Lilina hooked an arm around his shoulders, snapping at him to stay calm while she promised to unleash a healing spell right now, only for Marina to stare at them, terrified like something had gone horribly wrong. Marina grabbed his wounded hand and whispered that her spell only cuts out pain, then reminded him how it felt when she healed him. Lilin stared at something in stunned disbelief, yelling that this can't be. Rain stared at his healed arm and Lilin snapped in shock, "Wait, did you just use healing magic?" Marina clung to the main character, Rain, soaking him in a tight hug with a bright grin, and she blurted out that Rain was amazing. But Lilin snapped back that even healing a wound usually takes years of training, and doing it perfectly the very first time is basically unheard of. She studied the protagonist's Rain with a stern stare and made it clear he couldn't stick around, then stepped in and demanded, right to his face, if he and his crew were ready to head for Raybolt's magic school. Rain and Marina stared at her, totally baffled. Then Lilina explained that this school was packed with kids their age, and that the whole training program was designed to teach them how to use their abilities, plain and simple. Lilina's words hit and his mouth fell open a little. She said the whole bundle of it was impossible. Attack and heal magic together, swordsmanship and raw physical skill on par with a holy knight, and even alchemy-like techniques. Rain stared at her with a helpless look and blurted out that it was impossible, like that thought was the lock on everything she wanted to do, because he believed, take the shot and you could pull it off, freeze up and nothing ever turns out right. Rain claimed a fool had said the same thing, and that fool was a hero who aided the poor. Then Lilina snapped back that with him still so young, he could easily turn his powers on the wrong people. He swung that blade and the enemy dropped like meat. Then his fire magic roared so hot it scorched even the soul. The robe that used to be pure white split into red and black. When Rain spotted someone just as powerful as him, he leaned in with sharp curiosity and grilled them. Were they a hero or a villain? What did they look like, and could they really be human? Lilina said she had no idea, but one thing was clear: the school was built to stop this kind of disaster from ever happening again. Lilin's cheeks flushed as she beamed and teased that this place was packed with gorgeous boys and girls, while Rain, the main character, froze in shock and Marina shot her a look of pure disgust. Rain flashed an awkward smile and mumbled that he needed a moment to think, while Lilina insisted she'd stay 3 more days, giving him exactly the time he needed. Night finally rolled in and Rain was sprawled across Marina's lap, mulling it over. Maybe we should go to me after all, he said, then turned to Marina. What do you think? Marina snapped her gaze away and promised, I'll follow the Rain. Rain flashed a smile, but it felt off. She asked Marina straight up if she hated school, then Marina just sat there with her hand resting on her lap. Marina gazed at the main character with a flicker of sadness and said, It's not that, I'm just lonely. Rain stared at her and asked, When you say lonely, what do you mean? Marina swallowed hard, then told Rain how she'd sit by a desk all by herself and how nobody ever bothered to talk, because that loneliness was her daily life. Marina told everyone she'd just been sitting back, watching others sing and laugh, and that's why the idea never left her mind, and even the other girls started pulling their friends along to karaoke. Marina told everyone that if Rain had shown up back then, she would have been happy. Then her voice shook as she remembered watching those flowers grow, knowing it meant Rain had already ended his life. Rain's face crumpled with worry as she apologized, then blurted that he couldn't remember a single thing about his past life. Marina waved it off, cheeks flushing as she said this wasn't about that at all. She'd always dreamed of attending school in the rain, and that's why she was so happy. Rain blurted out that was exactly why her body acted so weird. Marina just nodded along, but then her face tightened as she admitted she feared the place might be packed with girls, so she needed to find out. Marina hurried up to Rain, grabbed the moment by the heart and blurted out if he felt anything for her, if he liked her at all. Then she leaned in close, tears welling in her eyes, and Rain answered her with a cold, simple no. Rain slid his hands around her waist, leaned in, and told her he loved her. Then the window blew open and a storm of flower petals erupted into their room. Rain, right there in the heat of the moment, lifted Marina onto the bed, kissed her sweetly, and watched her wiggle her legs as they clung to each other. Then, after a while, Rain eased back just a bit, and saliva dangled between them. Rain ripped off her clothes and started peppering kisses along her body, and Marina snapped, Hey, stop stuttering a little, before Rain pulled away from her. She snapped her gaze up and saw him staring like a predator, so wild and feral that Rain, the main character, looked like he'd turned into a wolf. Rain tried to win Marina back again, pressing down lower until Marina started making sounds. Then her mood flipped fast and she snapped at him to stop. Rain suddenly surged ahead with his magic, then Marina gasped, pressed her hand to her chest, and waited. After what felt like forever, the sound finally cut out. Rain snapped her name, searching for the right words as he called out. He stared at Marina sprawled in front of him, legs bent, guilt on her face, worry in her eyes, then blurted out, Are you okay? She barely had the strength to move, trembling from exhaustion with a faint blush still lingering on her cheeks. She jolted upright, cuddled into him, traced a finger down his chest, and insisted she was totally fine. She could even remember up to about the 18th time. Then Rain's cheeks heated with a blush as he stammered an apology. After a while, Rain finally turned to Marina and said with real wonder, What if we could become like the 7 heroes if we push ourselves in school? Marina leaned in, hooked by every word. She spun toward him and said, "If Rain's main character dreams this, then it's fate, because every wish a reincarnated guy makes the moment he comes back to life, it lands no matter what." With a stone-cold serious face, she blurted out that she'd been dying to meet Rain, and when our Rain heard it, he snapped in surprise. Why was she even here saying that? Frown tugged at him, and he realized in his head that maybe if he looked at it that way, it wasn't just a thought, it was a wish. A small sadness flickered across his face and memories hit him hard. He'd begged to be reborn as a famous guy with a harem, so now he couldn't help but wonder if this was exactly what he'd asked for. Marina, that girl, asked about the popular harem life, but a misunderstanding hit hard. Then Rain, the main character, jumped in fast and excitedly, trying to explain what he'd said before. That great people end up craving great sensual pleasures. Marina yanked a blanket over herself and snapped, mocking Rain, "Did you get your brains from Pow Pow?" And that savage hit stunned him so hard he learned his lesson before school even started: don't push it too far. From the stories of a maid's life you learn this job never lets up, washing first, then cleaning, then cooking, and even so Marina barely tried. Me, the maid, snapped at her hard, saying she never hired her to come in here and start eating apples. Rain couldn't stop himself from eyeing Marina's storage, because that thing could swallow up almost anything. He clocked it right away. She never once let anyone see what was locked in her vault, so he went for it, and when it opened, shock hit him. Inside sat the exact same kitten they'd met on the beach. Rain stared at the cat in total shock as it pawed at him like it had a secret, and he couldn't stop himself from thinking, "Is this Schrödinger's cat?" The surprise and pure confusion were written all over his face. The cart screeched to a stop at the house and Rain snapped that it was time to go. Marina just nodded back, saying it was good. Religious and May lunged in and tackled the girl and the boy into a tight hug, then both of them broke down in tears. Religious sobbing that he'd been waiting for them to grow up for the academy, while May warned them to stay sharp in the city, never try raw water and don't fall for strange men. Religious whipped his head toward Lilina and told her they were handing their protection to her, and Lilina snapped back that she was one of the 7 heroes riding with Marina and Rain, so there was nothing to fear. And the heroes vanished into the open. They slammed the brakes because Lilina suddenly felt sick. Rain murmured that he was begging for forgiveness, and Lilina, worn out, snapped back that she'd never been much of a fan of travel. Rene leaned in and demanded why the girl was tagging along, and Marina shrugged innocently, saying Lilina had an extra chromosome and it was basically useless, until Lilina snapped in fury, accusing Marina of being far too rude. Rain snapped the argument shut and said they had to move fast to keep going right now. The guy nodded, thinking of bandits, and Marina cut in, telling him to look up. He craned his neck and there it was, the inscription. "Come on," he muttered, "a whole crew of orc bandits." Marina and Rain figured these were the ones closing in on them, then laughter and yelling erupted right behind their backs, calling them unlucky for standing there, and when the girl and the guy whipped their heads around, they finally saw the gang. At the front, a girl bellowed that this forest belonged to their gang of orc bandits, so don't even bother fighting back because you're getting captured. The girl bounced in pure joy and yelled that she'd pulled it off today, no tongue-biting, no hesitation. The bandits erupted in cheers too, and one bragged they'd never expected less from the eldest Karen. Rain froze in shock, then grabbed his papers and showed them. This forest was the turf of their orc bandit crew. The guy awkwardly cut in and demanded what in the world was supposed to happen to them once they were locked up in captivity. The bandit boxed in Karen and shot creepy faces at her, while the sweet-smiling girl promised they'd snatch their food and treasures, sell the women into slavery, and don't worry, they wouldn't kill them. Marina and Rain closed in on Lilina, and the guy blurted out that he needed her for just 1 minute, something to distract her. Lilina snapped back, asking what was wrong. Rain whipped around and pointed at Karen, saying he needed a real shield against an attack like them. Lilina stared down the bandit and fired back, saying it was the same deal as with demons or wild animals. If they took the law into their own hands, there'd be no problems at all. Lilina kept hammering it in back home: criminals get sold into slavery, and if someone captures them alive, there's a gold reward. Rain demanded, "So how much?" She shot back, 3 million gold for one. Then the guy recalled everything May had told him. Before she left, Lilina made sure he understood. Every month she and his father would send him 50,000 gold. Rain grinned as the bandits reined in, telling them it was decided. He'd handle them himself on the money engine. Then Lilina's hand snapped onto his shoulder as horror hit her. insisting he didn't need to do this. Lilina blurted out what kind of battlefield she had in mind. This forest? Rain insisted she should handle it herself because he only wanted the reward so he wouldn't wipe them out in the middle of it. Lilina gasped in horror, telling him to get it. She's terrible at fighting, so she'll step back and let them handle it, and Rain just said fine. The boy marched up to the gang, and Karen, huddled in a circle of minions, smiled sweetly, demanding if they'd finally stop their whispering, while Rain went cold and said a man chasing heroism can't ignore villains, then yanked out his sword and roared for everyone to brace. Because this was no gang to mess with, just a bunch of useless orcs. Karen snapped with bitter resentment that they were just orc thieves. What good are they at all? Rain shot back, asking if that was really true. Rain blared that he wanted them to obey and surrender without a fight, but he already knew it wouldn't happen. Karen snapped at him with rage and screamed, "No." Bandits sprang at them from behind, and the criminals screamed that they were the ones being targeted now. But the damage was already done, so apologies came too late. Rain snapped around and readied himself for a fight. He knew he couldn't end the bandits for good, he just had to stop them, so he held back, moved in, and tapped each one lightly with his sword to neutralize them. The criminals shot off a few meters away, screaming as they vanished, and Karen blinked, scratched her head, and stared at her friends like, "Wait, what just happened?" Rain yelled at Lilina that he was begging for forgiveness, but the bandits still weren't dead, so the girl marched up to the criminals, told Rain to calm down, and somehow assured everyone it was still under control. Rain got ambushed by a bandit swinging an axe at him, weapon raised to strike, while the man yelled that Rain was just a little boy and he didn't need to play hero. Rain clutched his sword's hilt so hard his knuckles burned, panic flashing as he realized one hit from behind and he wouldn't be able to stop it. The robber got slammed by a wave of water that swallowed his head, and he started to drown. Rain saw Marina command the water like it was hers, and the guy burst out in joyful cheers, shouting how insanely grateful he was to her. Bandits were yelling to Karen that they couldn't hold out like this, and Karen snapped back in rage that they should all rush at once. So Marina dumped water right where they stood. Rain followed by slapping the wet ground too, and then the guy called down lightning. Every robber froze solid, robbed of the power to move. Karen barreled up to her friends and snapped at Rain, shouting that he was a swordsman, so it was unfair for him to use magic too, and Rain just groaned that he was tired of hearing unfair from a bandit. Karen slammed the magic artifact into the ground in pure rage, screaming that she'd rip her own ace from her sleeve next, because now it was too late to regret anything. Suddenly, the earth exploded into tiny shattering stones. Rain shrieked in pure terror. What the hell was happening? Then a massive stone monster clawed its way out of the ground. Rain's eyes widened in shock. She'd swear she'd seen him before, like he was ripped straight out of a book. That same dragging golem loomed there, then it planted itself behind Karen, just waiting for her to shout the word to strike. Karen beamed and yelled that she had the advantage now, like they'd all thought she'd just quit. But the golem lifted a leg over her, ready to stomp her flat. Karen never even saw it. Still, she cheered for the dragon golem to crush them. The girl swung her head around, only to find the monster already looming with its foot inches from her. She didn't get a second to react. Rain managed to scoop her up in his arms and hurl them away from the danger. Then he kept holding her tight as he stared down the monster and said, calm but deadly, that it was far more dangerous than anyone would guess. Rain snapped in front of Lilina, froze Karen in shock, and ordered her to stash it somewhere. Then Lilina blurted back that it was okay, just don't lose it here. Rain whipped around and roared at Marina to handle him, and Marina shot back as she called up water, lifting her hands like she was ready to fight. Marina drenched the monster in water, trapping it completely. Rain ripped his sword into the sky, flaming it bright, then hurled it straight at the monster as it tried to grapple with the water. Rain roared at him to take out his fire sword and finish him for good. The monster staggered backward, crawling into the ground he had no choice but to face, because fighting was suddenly impossible. Moraine lunged up to Rain and slammed into a hug, laughing that it all worked out. Then Rain sagged with a tired sigh, while Lilina and Karen completely lost it, screaming in shock at what just happened. Rain awkwardly shrugged and said it was only a steam explosion, until Lilina pressed, confused, asking if that was water and fire magic instead. Rain tried to hold it back, but the sheer power still knocked her breath away. Karen's cheeks flared as she stumbled out, asking why he'd saved her. Did he really mean it? Then Rain crashed down and she blurted back that if Karen died, he'd never get the reward for her. Herring stormed up and snapped, "Yeah, she blew it this time, so you've got to accept it." Then the girl yanked his jacket, pressed a kiss to his cheek, and stole the moment. Rain's cheeks flared as she blurted out in pure embarrassment, "What did I just do?" Karen jolted in shock. What? After all, she was so thankful for him saving her from that monster. Marina yanked Karen by the hair and snapped, furious that lying wasn't okay. The girl yanked a knife from her pocket and Marina snapped her gaze to Karen, demanding loudly what it was. Karen flashed a wide-eyed, innocent look and swore she knew nothing about that dagger that carried paralyzing poison. Rain grinned wickedly and said that was it, she was going to plunge a knife into the man who saved her life right in the back. Marina snapped that he deserved a brutal punishment. Karen's face went pale with sweat as she screamed in horror, "What are you going to do to me?" And she swore nothing should be done. Rain started stinging her skin and Karen snapped at him to stop, screaming the words like it couldn't wait. The guy snapped back that if she didn't apologize right this second, he'd keep pinching her, so Lilina dove into the bushes and clapped her hands over her ears. Karen, tears streaming, yelled that if he pinched her that hard, her name in the gang would take a hit. Rain smiled sweetly and asked what kind of prestige their useless gang even had. Marina hissed that this girl needed harsher punishment, and just when Rain claimed she had a better idea, tentacles burst out. They burst into tickling Karen, and she immediately started squirming and laughing. Rain gasped and demanded, "Where did you get the beach squid?" Marina smirked and said, "This inventory can store animals too," then pulled the cat right out to prove it. Karen groaned that wrestling a beast like this felt like a living nightmare, but she wouldn't break, she'd endure no matter what, because then the tentacles started pinching and tickling her nonstop. Rain declared they'd set up camp right here and spend the night, but Marina shut her down with a blunt, "There's nothing we can do," and Karen erupted in a furious scream that it wasn't necessary at all. 2 hours later, Karen dropped to her knees and promised she'd forgive everything. She sprinted up to Marina and wrapped her in a huge hug, and Marina's face lit up with a trembling apology, saying she was useless, yet still a good girl for trying. Karen's eyes flooded and she broke down into furious sobs and screams, insisting she was begging for forgiveness. Right then, a squid's tentacle shot out toward Lilina. The girl spun to Marina and demanded why the squid was closing in on her. That moment snapped the adventure in the forest on the road to the city to a close because they survived a terrifying crew of useless bandits and smashed the monster. The heroes charged straight for the gates of Reedle City, ready to burst in. The guards spotted a cart barreling toward their city and one of them gasped that it was moving way too fast. Then his buddy practically shouted, "Is this an attack?" At the front of the carriage sat Karen, hogtied in ropes, then Rain whipped his head around toward Lilina. The guy barked that it would be a disaster to fly into the city like that, and Rain spotted Lilina, sick to her stomach from non-stop seasickness, so Marina snapped, "We've already lost her." The cart slammed straight into the city gates, and the guard snapped that you can't just bull through like that on a cart. Karen's eyes filled with tears as she burst out, begging for forgiveness for what she'd done, then she snatched the mushrooms out and shoved them into the guard's hands. The girl offered them as an apology, but the guard snapped, furious that she should crank up the punishment and make him pay more for handing poisonous mushrooms. The guard snapped around to Lilina and said she didn't usually show up in their city, then grilled her about why she was looking for the knights. Lilina stepped in closer, and Marina fired back that she'd already bagged a crew of bandits, so she wanted her reward before she even crossed into town. The knight leaned in, hungry for answers. "Where were those bandits?" Lilina pointed and said one of them was right here. She spun her head and spotted Karen crouched behind Marina, and the girl insisted, straight-faced, that there was nobody here. Lilina yanked Karen with her and marched straight up to the knight, snatching out the bag like it was magic. She flipped it open and said the others were already here and that this magical vault could swallow anything. The knight blinked in disbelief and asked if she was serious, but Lilina just dumped the bandits out and said, "There they are, now we count them so I can claim the reward." The knight blurted, stunned, that this fight wasn't supposed to be fair and that unknown mania showed up just like the heroine usually does. Lilina shook her head and said, "No." Then she reached for Marina and Rain's shoulders and declared, "I didn't catch you and I didn't use that magic, those two did." The knight froze, stunned, and snapped that she couldn't be joking like that. Then Lilina turned to him and asked what he thought, swearing she was just joking. "Relicu's son." Just when he said it, the knight snapped back, shouting it could never be true, and they closed in on Lilina. The knight chuckled and said, "If this is Lord Relicu's son, I'd believe it." Lilina burst into laughter and replied, "No kidding, who in their right mind would?" The knight grinned and then, all right, time to start checking. A knight marched up to Karen, still trapped in shackles, and Marina's eyes burned with heartbreak. Before they led Karen away, she flashed a smile and told her, like it had been too short to matter, that even if it didn't last long, it was still fun. Knight finally came back to the room, dropped an apology for the wait, then rushed to the counter and said, "Here's your reward, 10 million gold." Everyone froze in shock at the mountain of gold. Lilina and Rain clung to each other, wide-eyed. The guy burst into loud screams, shouting how much money there was, and Lilina snapped back, hysterical, "Calm down, it's only 10 million gold." Then the knight yanked open the journal and revealed something darker about the bandits, like they'd once been adventurers, though nobody could figure out why they'd fallen into robbery. The knight kept warning, "You'll be tossed into forced labor," but Karen, Ox's leader, unless someone snapped her up as a slave, was doomed to be executed. Rain snapped back, saying it was crystal clear. He headed to the hot springs, grinning as he said, "I never thought you could still book a place like this." A bunch of people cornered the knight and demanded to know why he let in wanderers. Sure, they'd admit they were adventurers, but they couldn't believe the whole inn was booked out so rarely. Lilena barked through the wall that adventurers always show up here after a reward, and Rain smirked, saying it was perfect because they'd just caught this bunch of Neanderthals. Karen leaped onto the wall and shrieked that they weren't Neanderthals, and he said it on purpose. Marina yelled at Karen to come down because it was already getting dangerous. Lilina stumbled through the words and blurted that Rain was cute and way too much like Religious for comfort. Then she couldn't wrap her head around the fact that he actually threw his hard-earned money at a buy like that. Liliana stared at the girl while Karen snapped, rage blazing, "What do you mean by that, purchase?" She clearly wanted to ignite a fight. Marina lunged forward, snatched her up, and fought to calm her down. The girl rolled up her sleeves and scrubbed it clean over and over until every last trace was gone. She demands to know why she's putting herself through all of this. Next up, Lena. Girls shriek in terror and tumble on top of each other, piling up in one chaotic heap. Rain yelled that he was busting out, no rush, they could take their time. He sat at the table, staring at the door, waiting for the girls to show up. Then the moment he saw them, he burst out laughing and shouted, "I've been waiting right here." Karen slipped into her fresh new outfit and grinned as she called out, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to weigh you down." The girl tells her she couldn't find her size, so she grabbed a lace instead and made it work. The girl leaned in and asked Rain whether her new outfit looked cute, then begged him to say something nice. Rain ruffled her hair with a nervous grin and admitted it was really nice, and Karen lit up, saying she was just so happy he loved her brand new clothes. She'd never laid eyes on clothes like this before. Lilina apologized to Rain for making him wait, but he waved it off, said it didn't matter because he'd absolutely devoured that stunning dinner. Karen stared at the floor and bam, found food waiting for her, and the rage on her face exploded as she blurted that she couldn't believe it. They didn't even hand her a chair for a slave, just the bare ground for her to eat from. Karen plunged her hands into the food and snapped, "What the hell is this, meat shaped like that?" Rain awkwardly let out a laugh and shot back, "I thought it was edible, maybe it's even tasty." Lilina stared at Karen and snapped, "Rain, why'd you buy this?" Rain admitted he'd burned every coin on it, then said, "They're trying to execute Karen and I can't stand it." She kept insisting she didn't look like a bad girl, and Marina found herself believing her, because when you really think about it, only people like them could drop that kind of money. Karen snapped in a fit of rage that she was cheap, and Lilina shot back that if that was true, then she'd better work off every single coin they'd spent. Marina then rose from her seat and pressed her hand on Karen's head. She promised Lilina that Karen would grow into a real pro because she'd be teaching her herself. Lilina snapped back irritably, and honestly, it didn't sound believable the moment it left her mouth. Rain stared at Karen and asked, full of curiosity, if she even knew her parents. Karen just smiled and shrugged, saying she didn't know them because she'd never seen them once in her entire life. When she was little, the only soul anywhere near the house was the old man by the oak tree, and Lilina couldn't stop herself from asking how he ever learned to speak like humans. When everyone finally left, Karen grabbed a lollipop, popped it in her mouth, and then started talking. Lilina pulled out a hunk of meat, shoved it into Karen's hands, and praised her like a proud master, "Good girl." Then she teased that this mysterious meat was her reward, and Lilina stared out at the Rain. The girl asked him straight up if he was going to put a chain on the slave, then Rain shot back that he couldn't believe she'd be that bold. "Everything will be okay." Lilina and Rain turned their eyes to Karen like they were bracing for the next hit. Marina snatched the sauce off Karen's cheeks with a quick wipe. Lilina let out a weary sigh and told him the rooms were already booked, plus there was a slave tagging along. Then she warned, sharp and cold, that he needed to be careful because the boy could strike while he was asleep. Rain just grinned and said, "It'll be fine, no need to worry." Lilina burst into the room, stunned to find everyone already asleep. Then she spun to Karen with a grin and confessed she'd made the whole thing up because she's still just a kid. She spun around the room, shocked, and blurted out where her bed was. Then Lilina stared at the floor and realized the bed meant for Karen. The slave was right there. Lilina yanked Karen awake and shrieked that her bed had somehow ended up on the floor. Then Karen screamed back that she was begging for forgiveness. 3 days remained before the entrance exams. The entrance exam day finally hit and the heroes strode down the city street. Then Rain blurted that he was freaking out, while Marina shook her head and admitted she couldn't stay calm either. Rain demanded where Lilina was and Marina snapped that she had chores to handle and slipped out early. Rain just shrugged, and Marina, worn out, admitted she wanted Rain to ask Lilina to watch over Karen. Karen, heartbroken, blurted that she doesn't want Lilina, then snapped into instant scolding. Rain froze, awkwardly guessing it was probably because Lilina was always causing trouble. Karen said she could handle being alone for a bit longer. Then the girl told Rain to just wait for them by the gates of that place, only for the guy to cut in and say, "Nope, that's not a castle at all." Rain leaned in and said magic had a whole school of it. Karen stood by the gate and waved goodbye. The guy snapped that it was time to move, and Marina told Karen to be a good kid and wait for them right there. They stepped up to the girl and Raven demanded to know where the entrance exam registration was. The girl grinned and said they'd hit the right place, then told them to fill out the application right away. Raven began scribbling his name, where he lived, and the magic he could use. Then the boy grabbed the sheet and asked if it would actually work, and the girl nodded, grinned, and said she'd stamp it right now. She shoved 2 signs into their hands and the girl snapped, "That's it, registration's over." Then she grinned, "These are your exam passes, stick them where everyone can see." Rain got yanked by the sleeve and when he looked up, Karen was grinning as she thrust a sheet of paper at him, full of a drawing, and bragged that she'd even managed to write too. Rain blinked, shocked, and asked what she was doing here. The guy said she'd have to wait for them and Marina handed her the cat like, "All right, take it." She'd let Karen borrow the animal but only if Karen waited for them at the gate. Karen snapped that she didn't want to go. There was a dangerous cart right beside them. Rain demanded what dangerous meant, so they slipped outside the gate and spotted a cart being hauled by cows. Karen finally admitted, "I see it now, you're dangerous." Rain gasped in shock, "A cow," and right then a bang cracked open the air and a cow carpet landed in front of the cart. He roared that Lord Mew Griffith Bear from the Imperial Court had arrived. They should step aside. Rain glanced at his clothes and instantly clocked a badge, meaning he'd rolled up for the exam too. Mew raged, demanding why nobody stepped aside, but Karen cowered in the rain and yelled that he wouldn't listen to a single order, only for Mew to snap back that their lives didn't matter to anyone. Lilina burst out of nowhere. She shoved the door open and blurted that she needed everyone's eyes on her. She wasn't just anyone, she was the special examiner, and with the exam about to kick off, she demanded that all the participants head straight to the exam venue. Rain's mind spun in shock. Lilina wasn't joking when she said she was going on business, was she? Everyone at the scene stared at Lilina in awe, stunned by her beauty and practically buzzed with excitement as they counted down to the exam. Karen burst into loud laughter and yelled that Lilina's doing some weird cosplay, and Lilina's anger flared as she snapped back to get out of here before things spiral even worse. Lilina locked eyes with Marina and Rain and warned, in no uncertain terms, that if they even thought about stirring up trouble here, she'd shut it down. Then Mew glared daggers at Rain, and Lilina roared that everyone needed to head straight for the exam venue. Rain blurted, shocked that the exam was happening in the arena, then he just couldn't stop wondering what the heck they were going to make them do. Marina grabbed Rain and swore this couldn't happen, he'd handle it, he had to. Lilina told him to carry on like normal because everything would be fine, while Rain suddenly felt that evil gaze hit him. Then Lilina stepped right beside the monstrous doll, shouted that the exam was starting and made it clear. Part of the test is this doll, and they're going to measure everyone's magical power. Lilina kept insisting, strike the stomach with magic and stars will burst out, then go all in with your strongest spell. If you summon more than 3 stars, you pass the exam. The girl screamed that they were ready, then the guy stepped up, shouting to unleash fire as hellfire roared up in front of them, scorching the enemies, and he hurled multiple fireballs straight at the doll. Stars burst out of the doll as someone gasped, and he yelled it was awesome, then he grabbed 4 stars for himself. Rain and Marina huddle in the stands, rain pouring down as they watch the exam unfold. He gaped in disbelief, blurting out why they were chanting the spell like that. Marina shrugged and said she didn't know, but it sounded vile, and Miu overheard and snapped that this is how nobles cast their spells while common folks can't make sense of it. Still, he agreed, calling it disgusting, and promised he'd show real magic. Miu Griffithbear sprinted into the arena, roared that he was the Empire's rightful heir to its highest dignitary, then flung his arms wide and screamed at the wind to smash the enemies right in front of him. The wind slammed into the doll like it had a mind of its own. Then the stars started dropping out of the sky one after another. Someone yelped in shock as 30 stars spilled down all at once, and just like you'd expect from a true dignitary, he wasn't like the rest at all. Miu clenched his hand and the wind slammed the doll even harder until people erupted in panic, screaming that it was too dangerous and everyone needed to run. Rain and Marina threw themselves in front, shielding everyone as the gusts came crashing down on the crowd. Rian raised his voice and admitted he was terrified. He couldn't dodge, so he had to slice through it. Then the other guy snapped at Mia, asking if he did it on purpose. Marina snapped that he was totally aiming at them. The girl whipped around and ordered him to run, and the guy awkwardly muttered, "Okay," then took off. As rain hammered down, Lelina approached and asked if he could swing the magic sword, only for her to shut him down fast. This wasn't a test of sword skill at all. The crowd started whispering, and one of the laughing guys tossed out a snide question about whether he even wanted a magic sword. Then everyone said it wasn't belief driving him at all, it was pure fear, like it was a disaster to show up at a magic school swinging a sword. Marina snapped at their words, furious, while the girl leaned in and urged Rain to clutch the magic in one hand, convinced he could pull it off. Rain flashed confidence and swore he'd try. Rain stared down the doll and realized that even at full power, this shouldn't have been possible. He's got to steady himself with one hand and pull every move off clean and smooth. We have to slash the damage as low as we can. Rain screamed through the storm, and lightning crashed down like it was answering him. Lightning slammed into the doll, blasted it backward, and tore right through the wall. Rain squirmed and blurted out, "So, how many stars did I get?" The doll spat out a choking cloud of black smoke, and everyone screamed because it felt like the Milky Way itself had just burst out of it. Lelina said it like a gut feeling. He'd raked in around 10 billion, then Rain snapped, shocked, asking how she even managed to calculate that. She shot back, "Yeah, I tried to measure Religus power once, and what I found wasn't a force at all. It was a whole universe packed with 1,000 trillion stars." Lelina marched up to the shattered wall and snapped that she never thought her son would wreck the school, and when Rain's exhausted voice told her to quit, one of the girl's cheeks flamed as she blurted that Lelina was talking about Religus' son. Marina shot her hand up and declared, "I'll be next," while Lelina warned, "This is the final doll, don't you dare break it." The crowd started whispering that maybe she had power too. After all, she was tight with the hero's son. Maria unleashed her power and the doll's eyes popped right off. Lelina shrieked, "What kind of magic is that?" And just like that, they blew through the exam she'd set. Marina, just a little girl, got cornered by 2 boys. One demanded what she was crying about, and the other snapped at her why she didn't have parents. Marina burst into tears, begging them to finally leave her alone. A masked guy with a bag over his head burst out of nowhere and slammed straight into 2 hooligans, decking them with everything he had. The boy blurted out that Marina was untouchable, but the masked hero refused to let them off, no mercy. The hooligans bolted, sprinting for their lives, then one of them yelled that this was the second orphan. Marina finally sank onto the ground, stress crushing her, and then the boy yanked the box off his head, turning out to be Rain. He snapped that he'd told her to call him if she ever got bullied, then he held out his hand and swore, "A hero is someone who always, everywhere, saves people from monsters." Rain bolted upright with a jolt, then reality hit, and the whole thing turned out to be nothing but a dream. The guy dozed off on Marina's lap, then went betrayed, shot away, and Rain's loud scream tore through the rain like, "I'm sorry." He couldn't even remember when he'd fallen asleep, but Marina just waved it off and said everything was fine. Then she added that he looked gorgeous sleeping, that he's always beautiful when he sleeps. Still, Rain flushed and muttered to himself that he looked awful the moment he fell asleep. Lilin rushed up to them and the girl beamed that she'd finally found them. Then Lelina snapped, So what are you doing here? Marina just went silent and Lilina snapped that the chief examiner already told them an interview was set. Rain shot up in shock and blurted that it was time to start. Meanwhile, Lilina stared at Marina's daring outfit and snapped that it was forbidden, and Marina shrugged that she felt totally fine. Lilina yanked Marina by the arm and hauled her to her, saying she couldn't go like that and she'd even hand over her clothes. Then she turned to Rain and ordered him to head into the hall. Rain forced out an awkward "it's fine," then stepped into the hall, shaken by the wild feeling that he'd just lived through the strangest dream. The academy head strode out and blurted that he was sorry for the delay, then stared at Marina and demanded, "Who are you?" Only to see her perched beside Rain and Miu in a full shark costume, making him ask what on earth she thought she was doing here dressed like that. Lilina leaned in and whispered that she'd borrowed a costume from the theater, because it was the only thing that fit her, and the leader snapped back, asking why she hadn't handed him something that was hers. Marina shot her hand up and declared Liling's clothes were totally wrong, way too small, so the leader nodded and told him he got it. Then he boomed that everyone crushed the practical exam and they were free to head back. This interview is choosing 7 scholarship participants, and he said that since it all started nobody has ever matched the criteria, so when 3 people cleared it this year he was totally stunned and now he wants to hit them with one question. The leader leaned in and demanded, "So tell me, how are you planning to unleash a power like that?" Miu shot his hand up, rose from his seat and grinned as he started to say this question could be a pain for normal people. Then the guy added that he should be the very first to answer it. Miu cleared his throat, leaned in and started telling everyone a fact. His family, the Grando Principality, had climbed into the ranks of the 3 great principalities, all in a single generation thanks to his father's sharp mind and brutal hard work, and that the invisible magic he wielded wasn't something he'd been born with. The boy said it all started with his father's brutal training, and now he'd rise to protect the Griffin Bell's honor just like Dad and prove he could bring something great to that aristocratic company. The leader locked eyes with Mia, then told her he was genuinely grateful for her answer, because that speech, it was straight up amazing. Miu lifted his chin with swagger and shot back, "Of course I'm an aristocrat," and right then the leader called on the next person. Marina snapped her hand up and stood from her seat. Marina's cheeks flared as she blurted that she just wanted to be Rain's girlfriend, and Lilina watched with tired annoyance as she kept flaunting the rules. The leader gasped in shock before anyone could even process it. She decided to become a shark. Right then, the Rain quit. Marina screeched that they better not listen to her. Rain burst into the scene, arms flailing as he yelled that Marina was already his maid, so she'd be stuck with him forever. Lilina insisted Marina meant she wanted to be Rain's assistant instead, but the leader cut in, "So that's what it is." "How?" Then he stared down Rain and demanded, "What are you trying to be?" Rain's voice shook as he admitted he wanted to be just like his father, one of the 7 heroes, the legends like Legas and Caris, and then he steadied himself, claiming he'd become the kind of beloved hero everyone cheers for. The leader stared the boy down and snapped to Rain, "Answer one more." Then he pressed, "What happens if the 7 great heroes turn on each other? Does my will still stay the same?" Rain gasped at the thought that the 7 heroes could turn on each other and that he and the father would be next. Then Marina burst in and shouted his name. Rain said with total confidence, "Even if my father turns into my enemy, my will won't break. Because a real hero is someone who always, everywhere steps in to save others from the villains." Marina grabbed Rain in a tight hug and cheered that he was ridiculously cool. Then the guy chuckled, saying he was grateful for those words. Marina leaned in, curious if they somehow came from his past life, and Rain hesitated before admitting, "Yeah, probably." He said he'd heard them in the dream he just had today. Miu snapped that they were mocking him now, then raged that all those pompous words must have been stolen straight from a dream, because apparently that's all they've got. It was like those 7 legendary heroes had just stumbled into the demonic dragon's rampage right on the scene, while Miu snapped, demanding why they bolted the second they got their reward, and Rain laughed awkwardly, blurting that his guess probably wasn't right, and Miu went furious, firing back, "Then what's wrong with it?" Miu blurted, "Rebuild it." As the city shattered to pieces begged for salvation, and the 3 great principalities threw all their wealth and sheer effort into the fight. That's why they were crowned rulers in the first place. Miu kept screaming that the heroes saved people, grabbed the reward, and that was the end of it. But then she snapped, "So what? Without the principalities," she argued, "nobody would even remember those heroes." Marina's face twisted with fury as she demanded, "Shut up." He didn't dare mock the rain because the girl summoned stones that pressed their razor edges right up against Miyu's neck. The guy snatched up the stone and demanded what it meant. Marina just smirked that he already understood it all on his own. Then Miyu snapped, furious that if she ever caught herself raising a hand against him, their house would get erased from the map. Miyu detonated a hurricane of force out of nowhere, slamming Marina as the girl froze in pure terror, convinced the guy had just conjured power with zero spell, because there was no time to dodge. Just as the hit came, Rain snapped into position and intercepted the strike, parrying Miyu's blow. He started shaking and gasped in disbelief that he just snapped the magic away with his bare hands. No way this was real. Rain exploded, furious that he was apologizing for Marina's disrespect, and he couldn't even tell who was wrong anymore. Rain clamped down on Mia's hand and squeezed hard. Rain stared at Mia and warned, "This power isn't for fighting your own, it's for guarding your allies and protecting the people you hold closest to your heart." Miu watched the rain fall while Lelina stepped between the boys and snapped, "That's enough," because the interview still wasn't done, and if they had anything else to say they could spill it later. Right now, let them get back to their places. Lelina slipped, smacked Mia straight in the jaw, then yanked the others in with her. Bam, they crashed down into a tangled heap. Lelina stared in disbelief at what had just happened. Then the leader and his assistant bolted out of the hall. Right before he left, he told Lelina, "It's all yours now," and ordered them to go. Marina and Rain marched up to the gate, right where Karen stood waiting. Rain beamed and yelled that they were back, and Karen immediately asked if the exam was finally over, only for the girl to glance at Marina, all decked out in a Cerberus shark costume. Karen gasped in pure shock that Marina had turned so cool, and before Marina could even react, she grabbed her hand and swore she could knock Lalena down too. Marina just smirked and said, "Rain already did." Karen bolted onto Rain's shoulders and shrieked that he had to spell out how to take down Lilin. Rain answered that he wasn't sure it'd be easy, and then they headed home. And that's how the day of the main characters came to a close. Exam passed, celebration earned, and they even crushed one of the 7 heroes, Lilina. Now the next chapter of non-stop travel is waiting for them. Karen and Marina were in the bathroom, and Marina was gently washing her hair. Then she leaned in and praised her as a good girl for standing guard so quietly today, and Karen practically glowed with happiness. Karen beamed and shouted she could handle everyone no problem, but Marina's eyes snapped to the taming hanging around her neck. Then the girl reached up and touched it. Marina leaned in and grilled Karen about where she'd gotten that thing, and Karen admitted she'd snagged it from her uncle, the one she rescued in the city. So Marina went dead serious and demanded she explain exactly what it meant down to every detail. Karen kicked off her tail and said it all went down while she was just sitting there, waiting for them. Karen perched by the gate with the cat and belted out a song. Then she shouted that she was keeping guard right there with it. Karen slumped and admitted, voice hoarse, that she was starving. She stared at the empty boxes and grime-stained cutlery, and the girl's voice cracked as she admitted the bento Marina gave them was already gone. Karen finally sank back down, wanting to hunt for food, but the moment she left her post, she gets scolded, like there was no backup for her at all. Then the girl glanced at the cat, and Karen's heart sank because all she could see was just the cat. The girl clocked the guard dozing at the gate. Karen charged up to him and called out like everyone knew the guard uncle was supposed to keep an eye on her. Then she plopped down on the ground right beside him and stared, watching his every move. She let out another piercing scream, begging her uncle to wake up. Then the man jolted awake and stared at her, utterly stunned. She beamed and told him she had to hunt for food, so he should cover for her for a while. Then Karen flashed her ID, the one with a little cat picture, and asked him sweetly to hold it. The guy snatched the paper, still clueless about what she even wanted because all he cared about was going back to sleep. Karen bolted, then as she slipped away, she shrieked that it was a request. The guard stays planted, not moving an inch. She marched down the street, clocking everyone rushing to wherever they were headed, and when Karen's voice cracked with sadness, she admitted she already regretted leaving. Then she froze and said she felt totally lost. The cat sprang onto the box, then launched straight up to the wall and started yowling at the top of its lungs to grab attention. Karen stared in shock, screamed that she had to go back, and the terror in her voice made it clear. That place was way too dangerous. She paused for a heartbeat, then finally blurted, "Okay," leaped onto the box and carefully scrambled up the wall toward the cat just to get it. then she shrieked with pure joy because from up here everything stretched out wide and she was sure she'd spot something. Karen kept yelling that they'd find food for sure. Come on, just go see. The girl couldn't drop down yet, the wall was so freakishly high it wouldn't let her move fast. Karen strolled down the street with a cat in tow, and when she spotted all those shops she lit up and couldn't help admiringly saying, "Look at all this." She stopped at the shop, sprinted her eyes over the swords, then Karen pushed ahead and started rummaging through herbs packed in bottle after bottle. They kept moving, and Karen's voice cracked as she admitted all that was left here was inedible junk. Karen strode up to the clothing store, pressed her palms to the glass display, and lit up as she gushed, "It's a princess store," because the place looked insanely cool. She couldn't tear her eyes off those gorgeous dresses when, out of nowhere, a mouth-watering aroma hit her senses. Karen sniffed the air, grinned, and yelled that it smelled like meat, then spun around, clocked the tables, and declared the scent was coming from right over there. She stormed up to the table, planted her head on it, and immediately started drooling all over, then just stared as the man dug into his meal. The man stared at the girl, snapped to his friend, "Who is she?" His friend shrugged, "She's probably hungry." Then the man shoved a piece of food toward her and asked, "Do you want meat?" When she hesitated, he just grinned and said, "Go on, take a bite." He fed her the meat, then the second she tried to bite, he snatched it straight into his own mouth, and Karen stared at him, furious. The man and his friend burst into loud laughter at the girl, and with tears streaming from laughing, he blurted, "You really thought I'd give you meat?" Karen spun around and told him there was a stunning girl standing right there. They snapped their heads around, and there he was, an old man driving in a cow, leading it right into view. While everyone else wasn't watching, Karen slipped salt and pepper into their mugs, and the man let out a disappointed sigh. He said sadly that it happened. His friend just nodded. They took a sip from their mugs, and Karen kept a close, watchful eye on them. The guys launched the drink at each other, smack, and now both of them were drenched. One wiped his mouth and snapped, furious, "What the heck just happened?" Karen burst into loud laughter, then started dancing, screaming that they were taking risks just because they let their guard down. Then she laughed even harder and swore they should have seen their faces by now. Men glared at her with seething rage, convinced she was absolutely terrible. One of them barked that she wouldn't get away that easily, and his friend snapped back that she was going to pay for this, right now. Karen bolted to escape, shouting over her shoulder that she was begging for forgiveness. The men burst into a sprint after her, yelling for her to stop, and Karen snapped back that she absolutely would not. Karen whipped around the corner and sprinted harder than ever. Then the man screamed that it was the slave ruining everything, that they'd never let her go, and that she'd be caught. Karen whipped her head toward them and screamed that mocking people makes you evil. "Try catching me if you can." Before the words even faded, the girl barreled into someone, yelped in pain, then crumpled to the ground and rubbed her bruised head. She stared at the man sealed inside that square wall of darkness, and Karen strained her eyes, desperate to spot him. The man and his friends finally halted, and she beamed, telling Karen she had nowhere else to run. Then his friend turned to the girl and demanded what she wanted to become if not their masters, while the man pressed his friend to make sure they taught her how to apologize the right way. Karen shrieked in pure fury that the rain wasn't nearly as bad as what they were facing, and she couldn't stand the idea of comparing themselves to him. The man snapped his focus to the guy sitting at the table behind Karen, then demanded to know who he was. His friend demanded, "What's stopping us from grabbing that girl?" And the man yanked out his sword, swearing he only hoped nothing would go wrong. His friend snapped back, "If you cause any trouble for us, we'll beat you back into your senses and make sure you don't interfere again." The cloaked man yanked Karen up and hoisted her on his shoulders, and Karen grabbed his neck in pure shock. She didn't even have a chance to speak, just hung there caught in the wild mess of it all. The man barreled toward the cloaked figure and roared that they'd better not underestimate them. Then his friend snapped back, screaming, "Get ready to fight." The man sprinted straight at him, hoisted his sword overhead, and came for Karen and that mysterious stranger. Karen and the man slammed into the bully, blasting him flying several meters as his friends screamed, "We're in trouble." He yanked out a magical artifact, cracked his knuckles, and started chanting a spell, "Roar, Earth, give justice to the fools before you." And then Karen and the mysterious man stared at him, stunned as the man blurted, "Rockfall." A massive boulder slammed into view above Karen and her rescuer, one wrong breath from disaster, and it could crush them into nothing. The mysterious man shot his hand out and tapped him, then he crumbled into thousands of blazing shards. The threat that was waiting for them finally vanished. The bully froze, dropped to the ground, and stared forward as they taunted, asking if he still had the nerve to attack or if he'd finally decided to quit. The savior gently laid Karen down so she wouldn't get hurt, and the bully, still reeling, stammered, shocked that anyone could handle his magical power so easily. The mysterious man whipped off his hood, grabbed Karen's hand, and pulled her away from the place. Then he smiled and told her he was only an old man passing through. The man strolled through the city with Karen as she swung her arms like she owned the streets, and he trailed right behind her. Then he leaned in, genuinely curious, asking if Rain was her master and who she belonged to. Karen flashed a bright smile and said, "No, not like that." After a moment of thinking, she told him Rain was the leader of a pack of robbers that hunted in the forest, and that when she was moments from being executed, he tore in and bought her back, so yeah, she was saved. Karen chomped the meat the man handed her to kill the hunger, then froze, spinning her head toward her savior as she spoke that he was beyond cool and downright strong for rescuing her from the bandits. The girl studied him closely and boldly admitted she wanted his same clothes, then kept her eyes on every move as she ate, while the man clenched his fists, demanded the chance to talk, knelt down and placed his hands on her shoulders, and Karen's face shot with shock. The man told her to keep an eye on Rain and everyone else, then pulled a piece of jewelry from his pocket and slipped it around her neck like a promise, said it was hers to remember today by, and Karen's face lit up as she grinned wide and cheered that he could count on her. That's when Karen crossed paths with the mysterious man who pulled her out from under the bullies, and then Karen, grinning, leaped into the steaming hot spring, telling Marina it was all just like that. Marina stared at her in stunned silence because Karen talked about it so lightly it didn't feel real. Marina slid in behind her and lifted her hands high, then snapped at Karen, who was watching the house with pure fury. Karen didn't see it coming at all and she shot up from her seat in total horror. Marina snatched Karen by the leg and snapped that she'd stormed off without asking when she was supposed to stay put, stirring up a whole mess for everyone, then declared it was time Karen paid for her hooligan act, grabbed her, and hurled her to the floor with everything she had, making Karen shriek in pain as her punishment landed. Meanwhile, the guard Karen left guarding the place got stopped by the chief's assistant, who demanded, "Why are you still here working late?" And the guard just said, "I'm keeping an eye on the house." Lilina stood beside the mysterious man who'd rescued Karen from the bandits, and she leaned in to ask, right to his face, if he was truly certain about what he was doing. She pressed closer and revealed his plan. Riene and the others as vessels for the heroes. But the man snapped back loud and unshakable, saying they'd fit perfectly, then tiredly warned that they had to be ready, no delays. He spun around and there it was, Rain's father, a man of faith. Then the day of the great disaster finally hit. The demonic dragon was about to be reborn. Lena stumbled back home in the evening and Marina immediately grilled her, who was going to sleep next to Rain. Lilina snapped back, rage and exhaustion tangled in her voice. It was impossible to sleep beside him. Marina urged her and Lilina to lie down on both sides of Rain and hug him, swearing that if they did it that way, everything would turn out fine. Then Lilina burst out with a big, loud cheer, saying Marina's idea was perfect, and the girl added that she truly hoped they'd finally get a good night's sleep. Rian stumbled back into the room and there were Marina and Lilina curled up together in sleep. He stared at them, exhausted, and grim thoughts hit. Maybe it was always doomed because the plan was an absolute disaster. A brand new day dawned and Lilina set food in front of Karen. Karen gulped it down and blurted out how grateful she was. After that, she marched into the bedroom, climbed onto her bed, and groaned, "I ate way too much, but damn, it feels amazing just lying here." Lilina stared at her and snapped back in anger, "That's not how you're supposed to act." Lilina slumped and snapped that if Karen just lay around after eating like that, she'd turn into a cow. Then Karen shot back with a mocking grin that it was her own experience. Rain, Marina, and Karen were packed into the academy hall when Miu blasted his speech out loud, and heads turned everywhere, his voice booming like a challenge. He told everyone that even if their biggest goal still felt miles away, they'd better spend their spring of youth smart, not wasting it but filling it with real meaning. Then he fired up the room again. This day was the start of a brand new life, so they should share it with friends and never get flustered, not even by the name of the third Archduke of Griffinbell. Students echoed right back, thanking him loud and clear for every bit of guidance. Rain started snoring like a chainsaw and Mew tried to step down the stairs, then froze right beside the heroes, staring at Rain in stunned disbelief. "Rain Curtis is just awful," Mew snapped. Mew shot another glance at Rain. He wasn't just asleep, he was drooling through it, while Marina calmly braided Karen's hair, and even Karen had passed out from Mew's speech. Rain snapped awake as the guy's angry shouts rang out, complaining that his speech was so ridiculously boring. At that moment, Marina was trying to rouse Karen, while Rain scratched his head and told Mew that Karen had literally dragged him over, but the talk went on forever and nobody could stay awake. Mew fumed that the hero's family should be taught better since they clearly didn't understand the value of speech, and if they wouldn't get it then at least they should act right, and Rain could only give an awkward laugh. Some loudmouth blurted that I was right, then stormed right up to Rain and her friends, claiming they didn't even look like the hero's kids and that alone felt weird as hell. He closed in even more, raging that magic was just as suspicious when you really thought about it, like maybe they were hiding something. Rain's chest tightened with hurt as he threw it all back at her, saying she sucked at magic, that she was reincarnated, that she'd been abandoned, that she hated Shataki, that she was with Marina every single day, and that she ate Karen's Purin. The guy demanded Mew explain why she didn't believe it, and Mew's nerves snapped. She burst out, insisting she had no secrets at all. Then Religious stormed into the room and laid a hand on the guy's shoulder. He snapped at him to quit hassling them because they had their own secrets, like the wild urge to run off to a monastery. Then Mew shot to her feet, stunned, thinking, wait, this is actually happening. Rain stared at Religious, stunned, and blurted, "What are you doing here?" And the man just shot back, asking if it wasn't obvious why he was showing up now. Karen lunged forward and clung to him with all her strength, then let out a piercing scream. The old man came for me. And as she crushed her hug around him, the old man moaned in sharp pain. He groaned that she was just as bright and cheerful as ever. Then Rain stared at the photo, flabbergasted, and demanded his father why Karen had called him an old man. Religious stumbled through it. He'd come back to the city, bumped into her by pure luck, and lent a hand. Boom, that's how he got labeled old. Rain chose not to dig into Karen and instead pressed him on why he'd shown up at the academy. Religious glanced at the students packed in, whispering and watching like hawks, took a deep breath and said that since they'd already drawn their attention, he'd like to say something. He whipped around to face the students and roared, "My name is Religious Curtis. Starting right now, I'm the academy's acting director." He's sure everyone already knows his son made it in this year, so he doesn't even bother hiding it, while Karen climbed onto his neck and kept yanking at a clump of hair sticking out of his hairdo, and Rallius just ignored her and let her carry on. Religious kept insisting that his son was just another student, no special treatment, not even a shred of it, and he stared at everyone like he was measuring talent, declaring that this academy only assembled the most gifted. He's convinced every talent will spark into a power strong enough to rescue their world, and for a few minutes he just goes silent, like he's letting that truth sink in. Suddenly, he roared that they needed to become heroes together, and Karen lit up as she threw her hands up and started waving like crazy. Religious's speech stunned the whole crowd, and before long every student was clapping for him. Every student shot up from their seats and roared at the top of their lungs right alongside Religious, and the man threw in his own shout too, making it crystal clear he stood with them. Religious scooted aside and leaned in toward his son, tapped his head with a light smack, and warned him it wasn't right to doze off during a speech. Karen started to climb out from under his cloak, and Rain immediately apologized for it. Religious marched up to the kid who'd been tormenting Rain, grabbed his attention, and barked that if he wanted another shot he'd better prove it through their studies, not bullying. He snapped that at the academy nobody cared where you came from. You just had to learn how to get along with everyone, and the boy, shaking with fear, finally admitted he was only asking for forgiveness. Mew snapped, fuming that he'd dragged the guy into this mess too. Then Karen popped up beside Religious and started waving her arms, grinning as she cheered that it was a good thing, while the man leaned in with affection and told her she was sweet and lovely. Religious grinned and announced the ceremony was over, then told everyone to get some sleep. Classes would kick off tomorrow, and it was time to head back to their dorms and start really bonding with their new friends. Rain, Marina, and Karen burst into the rain and stared up at a towering building. Rain gasped, "Wait, this is our dorm," and Karen practically squealed, "It's huge." The heroes closed in on the doors and leaned in for a closer look. Marina told Rain, "This is special for you," and Rain's eyes lit up as he asked where Mayu had gone. Marina sighed that Mayu bolted for the dorm in a hurry, while Karen barely listened because the huge building had her itching to get inside, and then Marina shoved the scroll into Rain's hands. The guy unrolled it and the warning hit like a punch. Anyone who enters without knocking gets killed. Anyone who touches his stuff gets killed too, and if they touch him, they're dead on the spot. Worst of all, don't use the toilet or bathroom. Cross that line and he'll kill you, and break even one rule and it's over. Rain couldn't believe it. This was a real death threat and the shock hit hard. Marina shrugged and said Karen wouldn't even make it through the day, but Rain stared at her, stunned, and snapped that they needed to talk about it inside. They yanked the door open and there was May. She lit up and said, "Welcome home." Then she stepped right in front of them, grinning, and announced she'd been appointed head of the dorm. Karen practically yelled, "That's exactly how it should be." May shook like a leaf, stammering through a huge smile that she was just so relieved she could finally take care of Rain again. May nearly broke into tears, then she sprinted over and wrapped her arms around Rain, while May yelled that she was so happy her voice cracked. Rain awkwardly blurted that he depended on her too, and Marina and Karen stared at them in total shock. Then May shoved herself back, pointed right up the stairs to the girls' dorm and left to the boys', and reminded Rain that everything was already shoved into their closets. The heroes hauled themselves up the stairs, and when it was time to split, Rain waved at Marina and Karen and promised they'd meet again soon. Then he reached May's room, the one with Rain written on the door. The guy snapped, shocked to find this was the common room, then eyed the door and said there's no way he'd barge in without knocking. Rain felt like he'd crumble by the end of the day, not Karen. Rain ripped the door open and dialed Mia, but the guy immediately demanded to talk rules, and when Rain finally looked up, he caught a girl mid-change. Rain's cheeks flared red as he slammed the door shut, then blurted, "I'm sorry," yelling it like a panic signal because he'd barged into the wrong room. The guy just stared for a few stunned seconds before he finally snapped, shocked. What just happened? Rain rushed to the nameplate and double-checked it twice, hesitating as he insisted everything looked right, especially since it was supposed to be a male dorm. Then he cracked the door open and said, "I'm coming in." He spun his head around the room and nothing. No faces, no footsteps, just empty air, and the guy blurted in sheer shock, "There's nobody here." Rain shrugged out of his clothes, tossed his stuff onto the bed, and mumbled that maybe he was just exhausted. Then he stormed to the closet and snapped that it couldn't have been a dream. He yanked open the closet door and there was Mia inside. Rain froze in shock, staring like, "Wait, why is she here?" He couldn't make sense of it at all, what was happening. Rain hammered the door as a knock rang out, and when the guy opened it, he said he'd come for Mr. Mew. His name was Maggot, because he wanted to apologize for what happened at the ceremony. Rain told him, "Come in if the door's open." The second he stepped inside, you grabbed Rain and shoved her into the closet so that Maggots couldn't find anyone in the room, then you slipped back out and left. Maggot burst into the room and started claiming that Mr. Mia was supposed to ask him. Then the guy spun around, found nothing, and blurted, shocked, "Why is nobody here?" Maggot snapped back that it was totally weird that the room was empty. Rain's cheeks flushed as he blurted, "What do you think you're doing?" And the boy jerked and fought to slip out of my grip. Mayu snapped at him to shut up, then Rain stared at her, at that clearly female figure, and Mayu yanked his head away, telling him, "Don't look," because she had her reasons. Mew said the boys at the Imperial Palace aren't just hanging around, they've got an inherited duty to the Empire, because once a family loses its title, there's no clawing it back. Mew kept talking, but grief clung to every word, because her mother had died too soon and she was left to carry the whole family on her own. After her mother died, her father panicked about losing his title, so he raised Mew like a son, pretending everything was fine. But Mew warned that once she graduated, got married, and had a child, the whole lie would snap shut and they'd probably toss her aside. Rain erupted in anger, furious that anyone would do that to their own child. The guy snapped at her, furious like she wasn't anything but a thing he could control. Then Mew stared at Rain in stunned silence and with a heartbreaking shake of her head, admitted she had no choice. The moment she said it, she blushed hard because she was a girl and Rain didn't know what to do next. Rain felt the rain smack his head off the closet door, and Maggot's eyes went wide with shock because he knew he'd heard something coming from inside. Rain stayed frozen for a beat, trying to figure it out, but then Mew yanked him by the shoulders and hissed that if they got discovered, he'd better stay silent. And that was it. Rain turned red, realizing this whole mess was somehow even worse. Mew struck Rain's leg and tried to unleash a scream, but he shoved his hand over her mouth to cut it off. He leaned in and hissed, "She said it herself, don't make a sound or we'll get caught, and trust me, nobody wants that." Mew let out a loud breath, then snatched her hand over her mouth just as fast. Magat was reaching for the door when he snapped his head toward the closet like it was screaming at him, and Mew panicked, praying nobody heard. Magat scratched his head, muttering through his irritation that fine, he'd come back later. He stormed out of the room and slammed the door so hard it shook the air. Me, you, and Rain burst out of the closet like we'd been holding our breath forever, then let out these huge, relieved sighs. They dropped to the floor and Mew blared, "Listen to me, every single word, no matter what," as she warned him, "Whatever you do, don't tell a soul." Rain snapped his head away, told her he understood, and then demanded she get dressed right now. Suddenly, Marina burst into the room, and the fruit basket crashed to the floor, and Rain roared that every single thing she laid eyes on meant something. Mew shrieked that it wasn't what she thought at all. She insisted they'd explain everything right now, so she had nothing to worry about. Marina snapped with rage that Rain had dragged a strange girl into his room on his very first day, and she was already ready to unleash her power and make them pay. Night rolled in and May pulled all the guys into dinner. Karen, Mew, and Marina showed up too. The moment the girls arrived, the surprise hit. "Where's Rain?" Marina shrugged and said, "He said he'd go take a bath." Turns out Marina didn't just cause trouble, she froze the Rain in the air and hurled him onto the dorm roof, and that's exactly how our hero's wild academy life kicks off, packed to the brim with adventures. A fresh new day dawned and a full month had already slipped by since they arrived, and somehow, bit by bit, they started to adjust to their new life. The Magic Academy is the kingdom's top-tier powerhouse, where most classes dive straight into the wonders and dangers of magic. That's why Rain's grades are even worse than Karen's. He stares at his report with a crushed look, and every assignment is blotted out in red. Karen shouted, dancing nearby with a victory grin because she'd nailed that great grade, while Mew slid in next to Rain and stared at his paper stained with a bad score. She read every word, then drilled into him about why he couldn't handle the simplest tasks, and when Marina pushed him for what he didn't get, she promised to break it down. Rain just chuckled in an awkward, helpless way. Mew and Marina started yelling over who would be the first to help Rain with his assignments, and then Lilina walked into the classroom and smiled, saying they were getting along just fine. The girl asked for just a minute, so they stepped into the corridor and Rain leaned in, curious, demanding to know why Lilina had shown up out of nowhere. The girl replied that the purchasing department had just called them. They swore the ceremony would end with handing the slave to the scholarship recipient, but the timing got all scrambled, so Lilina kept pushing, insisting, "No, we can go get him right now." Rain snapped in shock, asking why they'd hand him yet another slave, because he already had Karen and didn't want any more. Lilina jabbed at Karen and said just trade her out, swap in someone else. Then the girl turned to Rain and demanded, "So, are you cool with that? Are you okay with replacing Karen?" Erin yanked out her report card, grinned and claimed she was talking nonsense, and then, boom, Karen even had better grades than Rain. He shot her an angry glare, seething over his failing grades, and Rain pivoted to Lilina to say he was on board with her proposal. Lilina lit up and thanked him for helping her, but Karen snapped that he better not be joking around. Rain met his gaze and snapped back, no way would he trade her for someone else. Then Heron exploded, screaming that he was lying, like the truth was blazing all over his face. They stormed into the store and right away a girl with strange ears greeted them with a bright smile. Then she asked what they wanted to buy, and it turned out they had everything they needed. Rain said Lilina told him to come inside, and after a beat, he admitted she also ordered him to go check the slave. The girl bounced with pure joy, shouting that they were the scholarship holders, and that they should have told her the moment it happened. The girl barged into the room and announced, "Every slave here is up for sale." Then she warned them that touching or hurting was strictly banned. Right after that, she threw the doors open and let everyone rush in to pick their slave. Rain and his crew barged into the rooms, and dozens of slaves stared at them like they'd just stepped into a nightmare. The girl slid onto the bench, smiling like she'd be right there, and told them to call if they needed anything. Right then, Karen yanked Rain's jacket sleeve for his attention, and once Rain turned, Karen marched up to the huge man, telling him he wasn't bad, while the man greeted Rain and the guy just stared at Karen and the man in pure shock. Rain snapped at Karen, demanding why he even needed a slave, and Karen shot back with a nasty shrug, "Then take that slave and make her yours." The guy closed in on her and with a smug grin demanded she put him back in his place. Karen fought back, insisting he choose that slave instead. Marina snapped Rain's name and said there was one boy there, and Rain groaned that he'd had enough slaves already. Rain whipped his head around and froze. There, right beside Marina, stood a giant dog. Marina slid out a paper and said the agreement was already signed and the dog's name was Dantaro. Rain couldn't help but wonder, was this pet more than just a pet? The man leaned in and muttered that Marina had already named him. Karen beamed and said the dog was huge. Maria told Rain she'd already picked a name for Mia too when they struck the deal. Rain snapped his eyes to Mia in shock, then asked, straight-faced, whether she'd already chosen a slave. Miu admitted she didn't even know how to say it right. She was basically made to. Then she shoved the clothes aside and pulled back from the girl she'd picked as her slave. A brutal mark sat on the girl's body. Miu snapped and said it was their trademark, their signature brand. She stared at the saleswoman and demanded, "So that's why you're making us move the deadline?" She shot her gaze away, cheeks burning, and mumbled that she had absolutely no clue what she was even saying. She recoiled in horror, knowing it was dangerous. If he ever found out about everything, it would get way worse fast. Then the girl opened her lunch, took one bite, and a dog charged up to her, trying to scare her away. Still, she realized the real reason they'd come here wasn't the food at all. It was to test how sharp her observation skills were. She kept pushing the same thought, out of all of them, there's only one truly special, and Marina reached out, placing her hand on the shoulder of a slave girl. She told Rain, "Pick me." The guy leaned in, curious as hell. Why her? Did Marina's strength really feel that unreal? Marina set the girl down near her and told Rain it was honestly great to hug her, and Rain, worn out, finally murmured that everything made sense now. He strode up to the slave and begged forgiveness for Marina, and Rain crouched beside the girl to ask her name. She trembled with terror. She awkwardly said she had no name. Most days people just called her you or hey, and right then Rain noticed the scars etched into her arms. The boy crouched in front of her and flashed a wide grin, and then Rain leaned in and asked how she ended up a slave, only for the girl to say she'd been abandoned as a child. The woman who grabbed her up worked for a construction company. She barely got a chance to work hard. She kept insisting she didn't even know the right kind of magic for the job, so she grabbed another slave cheap, then sold her off as if she was completely useless. She clenched her fist tight, then whispered that she was still alone, still an orphan. Rain leaned in, eyes blazing with curiosity. "So what do you mean, Shiro?" She really had white hair, but why would she say that? Miu told him she came from a lower race. People whisper that they're brutally weak, talentless, and that their white hair and pale skin give them away at a glance. She let out a heartbreaking sigh, like her heart had just cracked. Rain grinned and told her it was only because of that, and when the girl saw his bright, happy face, shock hit her like a wave. Rain let out a breath and admitted the truth. He'd been left behind too. One rainy day, he told me his dad trekked into the mountains to pick him up, and that's when it finally clicked. The reason he got that scholarship was simple. He was raised by his father, and yet, with that kind of background, he didn't stand out at all. Rain asked if he could say that about her, but when he mentioned the lower races, his mind clearly went somewhere else. Then he grabbed the girl's hand and pressed, "Tell me, how do you get injuries like this without even trying?" The girl choked out that she wasn't just begging for forgiveness. The scars looked downright disgusting to her, and Rain admitted, yeah, he understood why, but he still loved them because those were her hands. She blushed hard, then stammered out that she was insanely grateful for what he just said. Miu grabbed Rain's attention and told him, "I'm not letting you take me, because that'd be dumb," and then she warned him people were whispering that he'd been abandoned. Rain snapped back, "That's not a rumor at all. My name is Rain because my father picked me up on a rainy day," and he swore they weren't hiding anything, they just never talked about it much. The guy jerked his head toward the slave and nervously blurted out that before the deal he'd still got plenty of slaves. Then Maria shot back, telling him to look at her instead. She brushed the girl's hair back and marveled at her silky skin, then said Rain wouldn't regret taking her for himself, everything would be all right. Rain shut his eyes and howled at Marina to stop grabbing at her, then, right on accident, his foot landed on the vendor's mayonnaise. The girl shrieked with pure fury, screaming that he'd wrecked her product for good. Manny hopped onto the slave and the dog immediately caught it, then bolted over to lick it like it was the greatest thing ever. Rain blasted Dantaro to back off because he couldn't lick her, knocking that out was the only way to keep things from going wrong. Rain tried to step in, but a slick slip sent him crashing onto the girl. Then he sprang up instantly, except the merchant caught it all. With a bright smile, she told him that now he had no choice, he had to sign the agreement. Rain snapped, "What?" like he couldn't believe it, then before he could say more he just didn't. Marina and Mayu told him he should have bought it, and Karen grinned so hard she basically celebrated. That was exactly why he earned his 1 point. Rain wanted to yell, but he swallowed it and let out one exhausted breath. Then he told her, "It's okay, I'll sign everything." The saleswoman lit up and practically screamed, "Come back to my store again." Lilina and the merchant huddled in the tavern, and Lilina blurted out an apology for the trouble, only for the merchant to shrug and say that in the end he still went with Shiro like he promised. Lilina leaned in, eyes sparkling, and asked what the big rush was all about. She shot back that he didn't just need a zero, he needed a person he could train, and her father made it clear, teaching isn't just words, it's knowledge passed on. With a bright smile, Lilina told him, "Yeah, you can't keep depending on me, you've gotta learn for yourself now." The merchant leaned in, hungry for answers, asking how she even learned magic. Lilina just shrugged and admitted, "I honestly don't have a clue." Ever since she could remember, she'd been able to do it like it was in her bones, and when she finally walked into the shop, the saleswoman stared in shock and snapped that she wasn't exactly suited to be a teacher. Lilina pressed for answers about why she chose that, and that's how their wild, hard day finally wrapped up, because right then they met 3 brand new friends ready to shoulder the tough stuff together. Lilina burst into the classroom and barked that the lesson was starting, and Marina wasted no time calling the new slave Millie. Then the girl traced Millie's ears and practically gushed, "Those ears healed me." Marina leaned in, curious as hell, asking Mallory if she really liked her name. Then Mallory lit up and said it was super cute, only to snap, "Yeah, but can Maria stop tugging my ears?" Mew slumped against her slave and, with tired curiosity in her voice, asked why the beast slaves were so ridiculously beautiful. Rain shot back that she picked a cute name for her slave too, Lin, and she's really great. Marina leaned in and asked Rain if he wanted to touch Millie's ears too. The boy's face flared red as her words hit, then Mallory fumbled out an awkward excuse, saying Mr. Rain wasn't allowed to do that. Rain pressed for what he meant by can't, and Millie admitted, honestly, she knew some self-defense moves, so if a guy even touched her, she'd snap into pain without meaning to. Karen stomped her foot and roared, "Quiet!" So everyone fell silent. Because of their noise, the lesson wouldn't start, and Lilina stepped in praising Karen. "Well said, she was awesome." Karen beamed with pride. Rain stared at Lilina, shocked. "What did you do? Did you really cast a spell on her?" Lilina just smiled back and said, "No magic at all, we only made a promise to each other." Rain stared at Karen and demanded to know what Lilina was going on about this time. With a bright grin, the girl promised that if she stayed perfectly quiet in class, Lilina would hand her money. Rain told Lilina she'd only bribed her, and Karen shoved Dontero into silence and warned him to stay quiet too. Lilina just grinned and said, "That's the hero's wisdom." Lilina hurried back to her spot and declared, "All right, time to start the lesson." Then she had everyone pull out their magical stones and watch as she lifted one with her own magic, proving exactly how magical power could be controlled. Mastering that control was the real foundation for learning how to give magical assistance. Rain clenched the stone in his hands and demanded it infect the animals, twist them into monsters. Then he panicked and asked, "Will everything be all right? Tell me, aren't we just being fed fairy tales?" Mew gripped the stone in both hands and declared, "This isn't just any rock, its official name is the Demon Core, and every living thing with magic has one." Mew kept insisting this core was the lifeline that refueled them, because if their magic power hit zero, the core would start to crystallize. Mew warned that once this effect starts, there's no undoing it. Crystallization eventually devours the whole organism, leaving nothing but oblivion behind, and all it cares about is hunting a source of even stronger magic power. Mew snapped, "This is what monsters really look like." Reen wondered if that's when a person could turn into a monster, and Lilina snapped back that he was a good man for even paying attention. Then she asked if they'd ever felt magical power before. Reen said yes, and Lilina grinned because that's exactly why magical help is needed right then. Lilina pressed her hand to Karen's head and told her this is an exercise. Normally, a light touch did the job, but in a dire moment, Lilina made it clear, letting it sink in through the mucous membrane hit way harder. Lilina kept insisting everyone's magical power runs on a different fuel gauge, and if you flood the core with too much, it can crack, and in the worst case, it'll be destroyed. Lilina grabbed Karen with her power and lifted her off the ground, then told her, no escaping this, so they'd train instead, learn to do what she does and win or lose based on their skill and imagination, so she made sure everyone was ready. She told Lilina, first focus, pour your will into the magic, and then Rain slammed his power through her as the storm rained down. He blurted out that he was sorry, while Lilina shot back that she'd only said it had to be done step by step, so now he needed to learn from Marina how to rein in his power. Marina juggled multiple stones at once and Rain stared at her, totally stunned. Then he stepped closer and asked how he could master magic's power. Marina told him to use the method she'd shown him before and teased that it might feel even easier with Mallory. The girl gasped in shock, screaming that she'd go through it too. Then Maggot snapped, don't even think about it, the Shiro can't pull that off. But they're clueless about magic. Every aristocrat in this city trots off to the same magic courses and gets taught the exact same lessons. Then he said even hauling a single rock could swallow more than a week, yet Lord Mew crushed it in just 2 days. Perrin admitted he didn't know what was actually wrong with Mew, but once they even tried to teach Shiro, it would all be pointless. Maggot stared at Marina and Rain as they tried to teach Millily, and then he snapped with furious anger, yelling that they weren't even listening to him. The guy tried to walk off, then snapped, look at those scarred hands. He swore it came from failed magic attempts but said they could finally fix it this time. Mallory whipped her gaze toward the rain and said it still wasn't worth it, yet he grabbed her hand and assured her boldly that everything was okay, he'd help her get through it all. Rain urged her to breathe, relax, and focus her magic. Then Mallory finally started to feel it, releasing power she didn't know she had. He grinned that she was doing great, then promised he'd sprinkle in a little magic right after. Mallory screamed that something felt off and Rain's fear crashed through him, because he knew he might hurt her like this, so he steadied himself, but he had to be even more careful. Millily screamed with pure joy, shouting that she'd finally done it. Mallory hurled her stone into the air and Marina slid down in front of her, grinning as she admitted she could finally see how well she was doing. Rain smiled and said, thanks to you, I finally understood the principle. Maggot flashed an evil grin and snapped, nope, nothing like that. Then he hurled his stone at Millily and with a fake shriek claimed the Shiro stone had suddenly gone weird. Millily's stone ricocheted, arced through the air and screamed straight toward Mew. Rain roared at her to dodge and Mew whipped her head around, stunned, then she snapped her eyes shut and nothing happened. Lin snatched the rock from the air with her hand, and it slammed into her hard enough to make her recoil in pain. Lulina sprinted up to them and grabbed the slave's attention, asking if she was all right, and the girl immediately said yes. Lin insisted everything was fine with the gentleman, but Lilina snapped with fury, shouting that she was the one asking, right now, let him show his hands. The girl shot her arm forward and Lilina hissed that she'd acted too rashly, yet she'd back off, nothing, she'd help from here. Maggot spat in fury that Shiro's 2 stones getting shoved together was wildly dangerous. Rain snapped in rage, that's it, claiming those aristocrats would do anything just to keep from looking bad. Maggot demanded what he meant and Rain warned them. Maggot snapped that it was all Shiro's fault and teaching them was pointless. Rain fired back that anyone who fought to cling to life with everything they had a better shot than some stuck-up aristocrat playing dirty. Maggot lit up, basically saying, Rain's so stubborn about his claim, so he'll have to back it up. Then he spun to Lilina and asked if their class could join the festival, and Lilina said, we don't know the details yet, but one thing's clear. Duels between participants are totally off limits. Maggot grinned and said, all right, then I'm setting this up. He proposed a duel between Shiro and Lin. Maggot said they'd split into 2 teams and hammer the festival's training into slaves, then it'd be a showdown, the aristocrats versus the commoners, racing to see who could break a slave in the best way. Rage in his voice, Rain snapped asking why they'd dare do that, and Maggot fired back, saying it was him who'd claimed his Shiro was stronger than an aristocrat like him, because, as their rep, Lord Mew would never shrug off words like that. Mew blurted in shock, yeah, exactly. Maggot then cut in, saying there's more. He explained that the losing side has to follow every order and the guy shot Mew a look asking if she was okay with it, so Mew asked, can I request something? You really believed Lin couldn't possibly lose to Mallory, because if they won, Rain would do whatever she told her to do. Rain leaned in and asked Marina what Mew was thinking, and Marina said Mew looked like she was wrestling with the mess of contradictions between her heart and what she wants. Then Rain awkwardly told Mew, we don't have to fight, okay? Let's just go have fun at the festivals. We shouted that he'd have time to think how Rain could entertain him while he prepared for his punishment. Lilina stared at Rain and said he'd already crowned himself a winner. Rain grinned and promised he'd stop that. Then the bell rang and Karen lit up with a happy smile. Lilina told the students the lesson was done, then fired them up to practice with the magic stones. Karen slid up to Lilina, smile blazing, and asked why she'd been so painfully quiet. Lilina laughed and swore she'd totally forgotten, then gently petted Karen and the dog's head, smiling as she said they were both amazing, they'd be quiet just like they should, and like she promised, a reward was coming. She tossed the dog a piece of beef, then handed Karen the money. Karen yanked Lilina's clothes down and dragged the fabric away, and when Lilina clutched it all back, she immediately felt like she was being bullied. Lilina snapped, angrily demanding, "What do you think you're doing?" Karen yanked the clothes again and again, screaming that she'd handed Don Taro a chunk of meat, only to get back a measly little pittance. Lilina insisted she was okay and begged Karen to let her go, but Karen kept yanking anyway, didn't listen a bit. Then she screamed that she wouldn't stop until Lilina handed over a piece of meat, pulling non-stop until she got her reward. Lilina snapped at the rain to fix things for Karen, and the awkward guy blurted, "There's tons of meat back in the dorm, let's head there and Karen can eat." Mallory screamed that Karen could use that money to buy meat. Karen beamed and asked, "So I can really buy meat with this money, or I can eat at home, right?" Rain jolted at Karen's sudden move and by accident slapped his hand onto Mallory's shoulder. Then Mallory snapped into reflex, shoved Rain to the ground and started choking him. Karen raved that Mallory was insanely strong, and Marina shot back that if Lin were a man, Mallory would wipe the floor with him. Then Rain described the whole scene like this: just a little more and he'd be reborn into another world. Karen and Millie geared up to head outside, yanking on their sports clothes, and Karen plopped into a chair as she tied her shoelaces tight so they wouldn't slip undone while she ran. A week burned by as the festival clocked down. Mallory threw herself into training with everything she had. Near the academy gates, Lilina spotted her sprinting and froze in shock because Mallory wasn't just training, she was driving hard, desperate to beat Lin, the combat prodigy who had always seemed out of reach. And somehow, even while she pushed, Mallory carried this fierce confidence like it was already hers. Millie sprinted into the rain in Marin, lungs burning as she panted hard. The guy grinned and told her she was an amazing girl, then said the workout made her way tougher and more resilient. Mallory shook her head and said, "Stone cold sure, no way," even as she still wasn't used to running in shoes, while Rain, staring right at Karen, told her that unlike Karen, she was actually doing great. Karen got yanked along the ground by a dog since her legs gave out, and with a shaky voice she asked, "Why is this happening?" Rain, the main character, frowned and said he'd like to know too. Karen finally slumped down, breathing hard, and insisted she couldn't possibly lose to Mallory. There had to be some reason. The girl froze for a second, then burst out in pure joy that those were totally her clothes. Karen yanked at her t-shirt a little, and Rain finally told Karen, "Even if that's true, we're gonna get filthy during today's training." And Lily leaned in, all excited, asking what kind of training it even was. Rain declared, "Starting today, we've got this." Then the guy tore away the cloth to reveal a sandbox underneath. Karen screamed with pure joy that it was awesome, and Mallory lit up right beside her. Then Karen yelled at Dontero to charge straight ahead. Millie blurted out, "So what are we doing?" Rain grinned and said they were talking about training earth magic, and Millie's eyes lit up. She remembered a few spells, but she wasn't that great yet. Right then, Karen and Dontero were already tearing around in the sandbox, and Rain leaned in, insisting, "I bet you've got it, just like you're getting it." He explained that earth magic is all about creation, and if Millie frolicked in that sandbox like Karen, she might stumble onto something brand new. Karen yelled at Mallory to come over and help, pointing to a bucket of water in the nearby sandbox so they could sculpt easier, and together Karen and Mallory shaped a stunning girl. After 10 years, Karen finally decided it was hers. Then the girl gushed so Mallory could see how gorgeous their sand figure looked. Mallory just nodded, raising her head with awe as she said, "We only add water and it turns rock hard." Rain and Marina were sculpting sand too, and the guy smiled at Mallory, telling her it was the same as magic. Mallory shot him a question, "Is that really true?" And Rain nodded, saying that when he casts fire magic he only summons a tiny spark, then cranks the heat by pouring in more of his magical power. Rain leaned in and asked Mallory what element could truly pair with earth, and she grinned, "Add water to it first, then hammer it stronger with magic." Millie snapped to it, then blurted, "All right, I'm doing it right now." Mallory dropped into a squat, dug her hands into the sand, and poured her focus into the earth, summoning the hollow mud to listen and harden into a mud golem. A tiny monster burst up out of the sand like it was digging its own way into the world. Millie couldn't tear her eyes away from the golem she just brought to life. She never imagined she could pull off something this wild, but Rain made it possible. Marina slid up to the little golem and declared him adorable, and Karen grabbed his hand, smiling as she said he looked so weak. A dog charged in and smacked the monster right on the head, and Rain, our main character, shouted that if they just kept pouring more magic into him, he'd get stronger. Mallory, crushed with sadness, said she could only beg for forgiveness, and then Marina handed her everything. She told her to grab the dragon golem gloves and the rubber-soled tabby, no questions asked. Rain right there asked Marina if everything was finally returned to her, and she snapped back, "Yeah, but thanks to Karen's childish antics they almost got confiscated." Then Karen's non-stop jokes sent Lelina one step from getting hurt, and before anyone could stop it, Karen went and tied a spiked chair in place. Rain blurted in shock that it was horrible, and Melili snapped that she couldn't accept anything this expensive, so the two of them headed to the bench. Melili sat down while Marina pulled on her gloves and then said it all with relief. Because of them, Melili could finally cover the wounds that plagued her, and the gloves even had an earth stone built in, making them perfect for her. Rain, the main character, turned to Melili and asked if they could spar against Karen. Then Karen overheard it and burst into loud, smug laughter. She screamed that Millie had blown past her in the race, but she swore she'd never surrender when the fight started. Karen snatched the necklace, shrieked that the one her grandfather gave her would become a weapon if she rubbed it, and right then a massive hammer erupted into her hands. Karen lunged in to attack Miley, and Rain, yelling at her, pushed, "Fight back, let me grant you earth magic first." Miley crouched low and pressed her hand to the ground, while Karen hoisted her hammer and roared that she would finish it with one gift. She swung at Muley and struck, only for the sand to shield him because Karen nailed it right back, and Muley stared at Karen with sharp, careful eyes. Rain screamed for a golem and Mallory shot back, "Yes!" Then she called on the earth itself to serve as her shield and summoned a golem with the ground's help. Hollow's golem lunged into view behind Mallory. Karen lunged at Millie again, shouting that the ground was just the ground, and Millie grit her teeth, fists clenched, ready to square up and fight back against Karen's assault. Karen screamed at her to take the prize, and Mallory shot back, ordering the golem to strike. Hollows and Karen slammed into each other, and boom, a massive explosion tore through the air. Lelina, still loitering by the academy gates, shrieked when the explosion tore the air apart. Meanwhile, Rain clashed with Karen. Marina yanked the golem to a stop, and Rain snapped, "That's enough." Karen snapped at the guy, demanding to know why he'd stop her. Then Rain, the main character, shot back that it was just a training fight and they didn't need injuries. They've already smashed through the hard part, so they're sticking to the plan, and Melils admits she just doesn't feel confident in herself. Rain, yeah, the protagonist, said, "If that's how it is, then I'll fight you." And then she grinned so wide her fist clenched tight. Millie, tears spilling, cried out, "No, it can't happen, she won't die." Rain stared at the dog and said there was no one else to fight, unless. Millie caught his meaning, then smiled and confidently cut him off. "No." A man wrapped head to toe in bandages stumbled up to them and demanded to know, would he be fit for the battle? Rain froze, shocked by the thought. Who on earth was this if not some wildly suspicious guy? Mallory stared at Rain, stunned out of her mind. Then the boy grinned wide and said he was the teacher of the 3rd Archduke Griffinbell and the one who raised Lynn. Mallory and Rain, right on the spot, let out a shocked sigh when they heard it. The guy grabbed a mop and bragged that, just like him, Lynn could handle a spear with real skill, and he swore this sparring match would be exactly what they needed. He stared out at the Rain, flashed that they could do their thing, and said he wouldn't mind at all keeping her owner company. Marina charged straight into the Rain, sword raised and ready to strike. Rain shot her hand forward, grabbed the sword, and the enemy smirked. "I know what you can do, so don't expect me to hold back in this fight." Rain, cool as ice, said, "All right then, with my permission I'll go all out and fight at full strength." Rain snapped into action and rushed in to strike, but the other guy slipped every hit with crazy smooth dodges. Rain lunged in for another strike, but the other guy slipped out of the way at the last second, right as Rain threw everything he had into that hit. The kid grinned, snatched up the sword, and hollered that it was his turn. Then Rain got ready to dodge and slipped out of danger like a pro. He couldn't believe this was how the hero's vessel was supposed to strike the Rhine, and he kept pushing the math, insisting the distance had to be stretched. Then Lelina barreled in and slammed the fight to a stop, snatching the mop right out of the teacher's hands before he could keep battling the Rain. She glared at him, pure fury burning in her eyes. Lulina slammed her fist into his face with everything she had. She stormed out and screamed that he'd left her hanging at the front door, waiting forever. Then the guy wheezed back that he'd slept in and woke up way too late. Lilina shot Rain and Marina a sharp look, asking what had them so bothered, and then the guy leaned in like he was genuinely curious. Who was she, exactly? The teacher shot to his feet and grinned, Necro, and that's when it hit. He was Lilina's future husband. Lilina drove into him with furious punches and screamed that no matter how heroic he claimed to be, she'd never agree, while Necro shouted that he loved her. Rain and Marina stared in stunned silence, and Rain couldn't believe it as he demanded, shaking, if Necro was really a hero. Necro and Lilina marched into Religus' office, and right there, the moment Religus sat down, a skeleton rose beside him like it was waiting its turn. Lilina took her spot near the desk, eyes sharp. Religus leaned in and told Necro they hadn't crossed paths in ages. The strongest necromancer, one of the 7 heroes, the immortal king, Necro Cloud. Then Necro stared back, scrutinizing Religus like he was measuring every word. He told them he was relieved to still be healthy, and Necro demanded to know why he'd been dragged to the academy. Religious said it was all for the festival, but Necro snapped that his plans had gone sideways from the start, and then Lin's role was made crystal clear. She was supposed to become the hero's handmaiden. Religus yanked out a scroll and slapped it on the table. Right there, it declared the emperor had ordered the festival's location to be moved to Ryujijo National Plaza. The 3rd Archduke gets a royal order to personally hunt down every academy graduate and toss out anyone who's not part of it. So Rilliga tells Nikwaro that the emperor personally moved the festival to the Ryujijo National Square. Nikwaro says it's all clear, but then he blurts that it basically means they mocked him, and rage makes him crush the scroll in his hands. Relic already clocked it. On the very day the devil dragon showed up, the 7 heroes would all converge in the same spot. The slave trader flipped through her papers, gearing up for the job that could change everything, and she refused to let anyone down because this was the appointment of a lifetime. Festival day finally hit, and the whole crowd surged into the arena, buzzing to catch the show. The host blared, Ravel Magic Academy's main event is starting, then slammed the mic again, now slave battle time. The host was a trader straight out of a slave shop, and Karen and a dog sat beside her as she blared, today we're going live as a threesome. Then she slammed the plan down. She, Arashi, Karen, and Dantaro would cover everything for the viewers. So the scholarship students marched in, ready to unleash their slaves. Millie, Rain, Marina, and Lilina stepped into the arena, while across the way, Miu, Lin, and Necro waited. Arashi boomed that the heroes themselves handpicked the Shiro with wild potential, Malali, and then she slammed the next truth. The deadliest slave in history was raised by the Griffin Bell clan, Lin. With her voice shaking the room, Arashi yelled that this fight pits aristocracy against commoners and every family's honor is on the line, so she turned to the audience and demanded, who's winning today? Karen and Ontario cared way more about the food than the show. Then Rain, the main character, drops the bomb that they're aristocrats too, and Rain turns to Marina like, so why did everything end up like this? The girl swung toward Mayu and snapped that it was all because Mayu had surrendered to her own cravings. So Mayu erupted in rage and screamed that Marina had no right to say a word about it. Then Necro strode up and snapped, telling them to cool off, act with respect, and stop starting a fight, because the slaves were already brawling, not them. Marina and Miu collided again, and it looked like the next punch was seconds away. Necro clapped a hand on Ryu's shoulder and fired back that the Gryffindor family had zero to do with this, because there were probably schemers whispering behind the curtain, and they sure weren't about to let those plans get derailed. The heroes rushed in just to witness this battle firsthand. It was Duke Tia Gurm in all his glory, along with his eldest daughter Loptgurm, the maid Tirth, and Duke Jade Gennaros, and when Tia stared at Rain, she snapped that this kind of religious air was the reason he looked so damn weak. Religus stormed up to them and snapped at Tia, asking what her family was planning this time, and Loppet shot back, furious, that he'd better not dare speak to her father like that. The girl snapped that it would be okay if he were talking to Jade, because her motives are always filthy and sneaky, but she wasn't going to let that slide since he was saying it to her father, the one person who would never keep a secret. Earth hesitated, then told Loppet she saw it totally differently. Jade always reeks of a cruel kind of honesty. Then, with a heavy heart, he begged, "What did I do to deserve this?" Jade hauled himself up and snapped that it all came down to the power of lies. Then he demanded, clear as day, that the decree get signed so the tournament could run safely, right? Jade shot his hand up and blared for the barrier of contradictions to tear open. The whole field blazed under a blinding light, and Religus swore this barrier played a key role in the final battle against the dragon. Jade flashed a wide grin and swore this way every spectator would stay safe, protected even from attacks coming from outside. Arashi roared that everything was finally ready, and Jade plopped into his chair grinning like, all right, let's start the show. Religious thought raced with hope that maybe his nerves were pointless and nothing would happen for once. Then Arashi blared, I'm declaring the slave battle open. Mallory leapt back from Lin so she couldn't land a hit, but Lin stared her down and told her not to worry, she wasn't about to milk this fight. Lin yanked out her spear, squared up in a battle stance, and told Millie she'd end it all with one brutal blow. The girl bolted toward Millie to strike, and Arashi roared that Lin would end it all with a single blow. So tell me, was this whole battle really about to collapse in one strike? Lin was already inches away from Mallory, close enough to feel the tension crackling between them. Lin drove a punch straight into her stomach with everything she had. Mallory got flung back for meters, and Arashi gasped in shock, realizing Lin had landed a perfect hit and fully meant to end it in one strike. Then Lin suddenly bellowed. She dropped to her knees and clutched her chest like it might explode, then blurted out, shocked, what just happened? Mallory touched down safely, buzzing with energy, and Arashi immediately demanded, what happened? Because she couldn't wrap her head around why Lin was still down on his knees. The girl suddenly remembered how Malili countered her during the chaos dead-on, perfectly timed. Then Malili read her move and struck back. Malili splashed water onto the sand and bragged that she was a coward. Then Rain stepped in and turned everything on its head. For her master, she'll shatter the obstacle in her way and seize victory. Little golems surged up in front of Mallory, and Arashi's scream ripped through the arena as he realized she was claiming victory this time. The commoners erupted into cheers that thundered across the whole space. Karen and Dantaro were going at each other over a single hunk of meat, totally ignoring the chaos in the arena, because all they cared about was stuffing their faces. Lin braced herself, pressed a hand to her chest, and told Mallory to let her decide, like her priorities just flipped. Then she roared and slammed her spear into the ground. Lin sprinted right up to the shocked Mallory and screamed, I'm your enemy now. The girl lifted her leg, braced her body on the spear, and swung for Mallory, but Mallory slipped out of the way at the last second. Lynch smashed the golem perched on Mallory's head, and it blasted off with a deafening bang. Mallory didn't even get a moment to react. She stared at the wreckage, horrified as it splintered into tiny pieces, realizing one of her own golems had been nothing, and she hadn't even lifted a finger. Panic hit her, she couldn't keep up. Lynch moved so fast her eyes couldn't track him, and if that golem hadn't shielded her, she'd be down already. Millie spiraled in her own head and didn't even see Lin launch another attack. She yanked up her spear and drove it straight into Mallory's chest, so hard Mallory blasted upward, flying several meters into the air. The golem crumpled at her feet too. Lin slammed into both Mallory and him at once. Nobody saw it coming. She'd already been certain she'd crush Mallory in this duel, and she kept driving her spear into Mallory again and again until Mallory slipped her strikes and turned Lin's assault into a relentless storm. Lin's rage hardened. She clenched her hand into a fist, aimed straight at Mallory, and flashed a terrifying grin as she declared this duel was over for her. Then Lin drove that fist into Mallory's stomach with a thunderous thud, and at the very same moment she drove her spear into Mallory's back. Mallory slammed into the arena wall and a storm of sand blasted upward, swallowing the whole battlefield in seconds. No one could see a thing. In the stands, the crowd erupted in shock because nobody saw that coming. Down in their special viewing spot, Rain and Marina watched the chaos unfold. Marina's eyes widened. She screeched that Mallory was in trouble and she was already ready to rush in and check on her. But Rain snapped his hand onto her shoulder and stopped her, turning his focus back to the battlefield. With a steady voice, he told Marina to calm down. Right now everything was fine and there was nothing to fear. Lin charged up to where Millie had crashed in. Her strike had blown a chunk out of the wall. Millie was probably out cold, so Lin just had to finish the job. Between the scattered stones sat Millie's golem, beaten and motionless, and when it didn't twitch or breathe, Lin knew she'd won. Suddenly, Lin got yanked by the leg. Mallory. Lin snapped his gaze down and found a massive hole in the ground, and there she was, sitting in it, waiting for him to fall right into her trap. Mallory lunged in and ballooned her fist, then slammed Lin with everything she had, but Lin still managed to partially dodge, even though she was left utterly shocked that she hadn't crumpled to the ground. Mallory finally landed the hit on Lin, tearing part of her clothes across the chest, leaving Lin exposed and furious because Mallory had thought she already won. Arashi screamed in pure shock as Alili's brutal counterattack slammed into them, and the fight kept raging on. Lin didn't see Mallory's stubbornness coming, and she snapped around in shock, because Mallory was furious, insisting that no matter what Lin tried, it would all be pointless, like she was just a simple shiro nobody ever believes in. Mallory strode up to Lin, and the thought hit her like an itch. She'd bet she'd have said all this before, then tossed it aside, choosing not to fight and not even letting herself have a shot at winning. Mallory kept arguing that Rain, yes, the one who said he loved these scarred arms from bullying and training, was right, and then she launched at Lin in a blur, striking with everything she had to take the win because nothing mattered more to her today than beating Lin. The stone on Millily's gloves nearly cracked to dust, because Marina wouldn't stop living rent-free in her head, praising her white hair as beautiful and pushing the main character, Rain, to take her. Millily, in her white glove, pressed her hand to the ground and stared down at it, covering it from above, like she needed to believe that this was why it was happening. So she clenched her will and told herself she had to hold on a little longer because she still had something to fight for. Religious blurted, stunned, that a crushing weight was pressing down on him. Then he heard the crowd erupt as people surged up and waved their arms, screaming for their favorites. He swore the oppressive force might be the spectators' wild magical power, but when he stared at the glowing field, another thought hit him. Maybe it was the barrier doing it all. One of the heroes leaned toward Religious and said, maybe the slaves using that stone, maybe it's even the devil dragon's magic stone. The moment those words hit the air, Religious snapped his head toward the speaker like he'd been struck, because he sure as hell didn't expect to hear that. Mallory snatched her hand, staring at it like it had betrayed her, and shock crawled through her body, like the earth itself was draining her life. Then, boom, an explosion tore the sand up into the sky so fast that the world turned into nothing but blazing dust. No one could see a thing, and the screams hit instantly, pure panic. Rain, the main guy, threw his hands over his face, bracing for the crushing force of the blast. Marina stood right there, but the battlefield made zero sense to her in that chaos. Lin clamped down on her spear, gripping for dear life because her strength was already gone after fighting Mallory, and now she had to survive the explosion on fumes, gasping with every breath. A bone-chilling monster clawed its way out of the sand, dragon-shaped but stitched together from pure bones with only ragged skin stretched into wings, so terrifying and powerful it made the air feel heavy. Rain, the main character, spotted the monster and blurted out in shock that it was a dragon skeleton. Then the real question hit. Why was it here? Right after that, the guy started scanning the battlefield, hunting for his girlfriend. Rain blurted loud as thunder, Millie, give me a sign you're okay. And then the guy finally caught the outline of someone in the wreckage. Rain's whole heart clenched, praying it was Millie, praying she was alive and fine. Right then, Marina stormed up to him and Millie was in her arms. The girl who'd run right after the explosion had done it. She found her and she brought her back. Marina stood confident and told Rain she's completely okay. Stop worrying. She set Millie down on the ground. Rain sprinted over, dropped to his knees and checked her like she might break. His fear was off the charts. Millie, exhausted, rasped, I'm sorry, I messed up and I couldn't handle it. Rain shook his head hard. Don't apologize, just tell me you're okay. He turned to Marina with a bright smile and said, thanks, I'm really grateful for your help. Suddenly his smile vanished. Marina was in trouble and he could see it immediately. Dozens of hands clamped onto Marina and pinned her in place, trapping her on the dragon skeleton's body, the battlefield she'd been stuck on all this time. Rain blurted to Marina that he was coming to save her, then sprinted toward her as disaster crept closer, until he almost made it and bam asterisk, he slammed into an invisible wall. Jade strode up to Rain and burst into loud laughter, telling him he couldn't break through the barrier and swearing he'd never let anyone stop him like they did last time. Rain stared at Jade in shock, totally lost, and rage flared in his chest, because for the last time he couldn't believe he was talking about this, plus that man's voice sounded wildly familiar like he'd heard it before. Rain got hit with a wave of memories from his past life, and just as he crossed, Marina didn't follow, she stood behind him. Rain whipped his head around, stunned, and demanded why she was still there when they had to go. The truck roared in, but Marina barely moved. She stared, tears spilling as she whispered that she didn't get what was happening now, she couldn't move at all. Rain's eyes widened as he stared at Marina. He couldn't stop himself from wanting to step closer until he saw something horrifying lurking behind her, a shadow that clung to her like a grip. Rain shot his hand out toward her and wondered who could be doing this, and when he finally looked, Jade stood there grinning ear to ear, laughing like it was all a joke. Right now in the arena, Jade closed the distance to Marina and touched her, then grinned and said he'd finally got the remains of the dragon. Marina couldn't move and had no way to protect herself. Before all that, their everyday life stayed calm and easy, until one day Mallory and Karen jumped into the bath together and splashed around, laughing like it was the best day ever. Marina watched them and grinned, saying they looked just like sisters. The girls climbed out and Karen threw her arms around Marina's shoulders, smiling wide as she declared, "If we're really sisters, then I've gotta be the older one." And she winked and added, "Because Mallory is still little." She sized up their bodies and felt a sharp letdown, because even now Karen was still the smallest. Karen burst into loud tears and wailed that at this rate she'd never become an older sister, and she just wanted to be like Lilina. Millie shot back that yes, she really did want to be like Lilina, and then promised that if that's what she wanted, she'd do everything for it. She remembered Lilina's face, and Millie's magic even forced Karen to sport the exact same high ponytail just like Lilina. With a grin, Millie said everything was set. Suddenly, Karen stood there as the older sister, cheering that she looked just like Lilina, while Marina let out a tired sigh and demanded who, exactly, was supposed to be older. Jade stroked Marina again and grinned, saying he finally got the dragon core, yet Marina's growth shot even higher than anyone expected and she still lay unconscious. Rain, the main character, slammed into the protective barrier with everything he had, cracks spiderwebbed across it, then screamed at the top of his lungs to yank his hands off Marina and let her go. Rain poured every last drop of magic into that blow, then the protective barrier shattered, sending him into the arena. Rain snatched his sword and fixed Jade with a burning stare as Jade grabbed Marina. Jade snapped that he wouldn't quit until he got rid of him, then he strode toward the Rain to kick off the fight for Marina, because losing was never an option. Rain erupted in rage, screaming for him to yank his hands off Marina, and the guy yelped, snapping his sword toward Jade, because Rain couldn't stand to leave Marina hanging. He had to protect her no matter what. Rain almost slashed straight for Jade's neck, then Tirtha shot in, catching the sword with his hand. She perched on the guy's shoulder, then tossed the sword aside and blurted, "I'm sorry, Rain, this was my fault." With a shaky hand on Jade's hat, she warned Rain if Jade dies, trouble will explode. And she didn't want that chaos, so she promised she'd protect him. Rain snapped his gaze at the couple, fury burning because he couldn't figure out why they needed Marina. No way was he handing her over to anyone. Tirth shot a black ball into the air and bellowed that it was a gravity path spell, then stayed planted on Jade's shoulder. The man grinned like a villain and stared straight at Rain, practically trembling with excitement as he waited for Rain to fall. Rage pinned him to the ground, he couldn't move, and he snapped that none of the 7 heroes would ever do something like this. Then Tia and Loput finally stepped up to Jad and Tirth, standing shoulder to shoulder with their allies. Jade teased Rain, cracking up and asking if he still thought they were heroes, then muttered that he was a total simpleton, same old Religus, and sure enough, that's where Rain's kid came from. Jade grinned and said, "We're the ones pulling the strings behind the curtain, locked away, forbidden to speak. We're the real demons. Jade, Tirth, Tia, and Loput aren't heroes." Rain stared in disbelief and snapped that this was pure nonsense, because nobody had ever survived the transformation, not once. Jade stared at Tia and Loput with a heavy heart, then muttered that this was exactly what he'd expected them to learn at the academy. Jade warned that a normal body can't survive it. It turns to crystal, then the person blacks out and morphs into a real monster, and she added that once the change starts, they're tossed into an underground dungeon with nothing left but to wait for death. But this isn't a place to sit back and fade away, because the man went on, swearing that after hundreds of years, even the kingdom of darkness finally got cut down. This happened to Jade, his transformation worked, and then he burst back to life like he'd been reborn from the ashes. Jade bared a wicked grin at Rain and claimed that unlike any other race, they were built tougher, soaked up more mana, and lived far longer, so they had to take control of the surface. The man smirked and said, "We never pictured the simplest foes were staring at heroes, Lilina, Religus, and Necro." He admitted their mana isn't infinite, but their reserves are monstrously huge. And Jade snapped, "And right here, right now, the idea to forge a weapon is born." The dragon let out a thunderous roar, and the moment people tried to flee, their bodies started hardening into glittering crystals. Rain let out a shocked shout because that secret weapon can turn people into crystals. Right then, Reliqueus crumpled to the ground, unable to fight, drained and helpless. Jade grinned as the dragon kept siphoning mana from everyone around it, and the only way to stop it was to forcefully convert the one carrying the dragon core, meaning the heroes would keep getting weaker, two problems crushed with one move. The man even claimed it all ended up being her marriage. King's core was crumbling from within, and Marina still lay unconscious, unmoving. Rain screamed in horror, saying the whole royal family was gone. Then Jade cut in with a grin, telling him it all got wiped out in the decisive battle against the dragon, though their blood hadn't vanished completely. Jade went, "That princess has magic in her blood, and I'm dying to use that gift before it slips away." But I clutch my daughter to my chest, because Jade killed her with his own hands. Jade said it was the only way he wouldn't end up embarrassing himself again. Then he stitched the princess's core into her daughter, flung her into another world, and waited for the girl to finally grow up. Turns out the child was Marina. Jade swore their plan had crashed thanks to Rain's interference, but nobody expected she could move on her own. Rain's fury exploded as he snapped that he'd robbed Marina of happiness for this asterisk. And hearing it, the guy went white-hot with rage. Still, he forced himself to break the spell of attraction and yanked his sword into his grip. Tia strode up to Jade and said, "Don't worry, leave the rest to us, I've got to retreat." He stared at Religious and growled that no one would be able to stop him soon. Then Jade snapped around and said, "I'm out." Rain sprang forward, shouted that he wouldn't let that guy escape, and Jade grinned wickedly at the one who just dared to pick a fight. Tia slashed Rain's attack out of the way with her sword, and then the man snapped. He'd take Rain on himself, sword up high, swinging straight for the young guy. Rain dodged out of the way and a wicked grin spread across his face. Tia's moves were the same ones his father used. Rain sprinted straight up to Tu and started pounding him, rage burning in his chest as he swore this was it. Over right here. Tia thrust his hand toward Rain and unleashed fire magic boom. A monstrous pillar of flame slammed into Rain, and he didn't even see it coming because in his head this was a sword-only showdown. Rain, totally scorched, crashed to the ground, jaw clenched as rage surged. This is just ordinary flame, how could a basic spell hit this hard? He miscalculated. Tia stared at him and told him he'd stop bothering them and now he had to sleep. Sleep, son of Reliqueus, while the man shuffled farther and farther away from Rain. Rain lunged to grab Tia, but she was already miles away. Dizziness swallowed him, and as his vision faded, the only thought left in his mind was that he could still rip Marina out of their hands. Rain snapped his eyes open to find himself back in his room, splayed on the bed, wrapped head to toe in bandages, while Karen and Malili slept right beside him, keeping watch the entire time. Rain stared at them and grinned, sweet and adorable. Then he gently stroked Karen's head and she jolted awake, staring at Rain for a few heartbeats before snapping upright. Karen burst out screaming with joyful excitement that he'd finally woken up, and that scream immediately roused Malili too. She stared at the Rain like it had just betrayed her, then bolted for the exit, shouting that she'd call May right now. Karen leaped through the Rain and clung to him tight, squeezing him like she'd never let go. He stared at her, shocked, and snapped, "What happened? If you squeeze me like that, I can die." Karen burst into loud cries and clung to Rain even tighter, screaming that he'd been out for 3 whole days and she'd already been sure he'd never wake up again. She didn't want to lose him. She snapped, demanding who was supposed to look after her, and Rain shot back that she'd take care of herself. He stared out the window, still stunned that Rain, the main character, couldn't believe it was real that 3 whole days had already slipped by. Then Rain's jaw tightened, rage flaring as he insisted he'd been reborn, chosen as something special, destined to be a hero, because deep down none of it felt like anything but pure nonsense. Marina always had his back. Then Karen and Malili suddenly showed up and moved in with them. Rain yanked the blanket, heart pounding, and pushed his thoughts forward, sure he'd ended up here by mistake. The door slammed open and me burst into the room with Malili, while Rain and Karen's eyes widened in shock. Me beamed and shouted that Mr. Main Character Rain had finally woken up. She slammed into him with a tight hug and burst into tears, while May's voice cracked as she screamed how relieved she was that he was okay. Then Rain, awkward as ever, mumbled an apology for making her worry. May let him go and stepped up beside the bed. Then Rain, the main character, pushed himself upright and said he'd been told 3 whole days had slipped by. The guy leaned in, eyes sharp, asking the girl what in the world was happening with the festival and the city. May said with tired disbelief that the dragon's remains had literally swallowed the whole arena, and she'd also heard it didn't stop there. Its corrosion crawled all the way to the capital, and the damage was absolutely monstrous. And just like that, Mr. Necro stops the outbreak cold with necromancy, while Leilina rushes in, treating and backing the victims from the nearby lands. The girl added that with their father's orders hanging over them, Miyu and Lin rushed back to the mansion, plus they had to tell everything about Mr. Religious too. Rain shot up from the bed and cut May off mid-sentence, then hurried over and told her he was thankful, because he needed to speak to his father face-to-face, but first he had to run save Marina. He stared at him in stunned disbelief. She shrieked that he'd never pull it off. May strode right up to him, planted her hands on his shoulders and blared that after everything that went down, the city was in total pandemonium, and if he dared step outside, who knew what would strike next. Rain, Relagis's son, said he was heading there no matter what, confidently as could be, and May stared at him for a few seconds before shrugging it off. She'd get his clothes ready so he could step outside and go hunt down Marina. Rain slipped into his clothes and headed out to May, staring at everything like it might bite, finally admitting, quiet and unsure, that these were his father's things, and right then he stepped out armored, cloak wrapped tight on his back. May grinned ear to ear and told Rain she had it tailored to fit him. Yeah, it looked a bit worn, but when the decisive battle hits, that armor is pure must-have. Karen, Millie, and Dontero's dog trotted up into the rain, and Karen grinned so wide she shouted, "We're ready." Rain, the main character, grabbed their attention and demanded they come with her. Karen leaned in, curious, and asked what he wanted, and Mallory didn't miss a beat. She listened like her life depended on it. Then Rain, the main character, rubbed both Karen and Mallory's heads, and the two of them burst into happy smiles, clearly loving every second, while Rain grinned wide and thanked them from the bottom of his heart. Then he cut in, saying it was way too dangerous out there, so they had to stay home. May, Mallory, and Karen rushed outside to see Rain off. Karen even waved hard and yelled at him to come back fast. Rain shot back with a loud promise he'd return soon, but with Marina. He only made it a few steps down the path when a group of guys clocked him, threw a rock, and smashed it into his head. Rain, the main character, screamed in agony, because that hit was the last thing he saw coming. One of the guys snapped with rage at Rain, demanding where he thought he was going. Was the traitor really about to slip away and escape? Karen saw it all and bolted straight at the guys who'd messed with Rain, screaming through clenched rage that she was about to give them what they deserved. Rain blared for her to stop, and that sudden order stunned her. Still, she obeyed. Rain flashed a calm smile to steady her, and when Karen looked up, tears spilled instantly while Malia watched, heart hammering with worry. At the academy, the students started hurling rocks at Rain, screaming that he wasn't a hero, just a total lie, and that he'd be back to hanging out with a demon again, so he had to flee the city. Rain yanked his hood over his head to shield himself from the blows. On the day of the decisive battle, they told Millie and Karen one more cruel detail. She'd been watching Mr. Religious too. Karen and Millie listened to me with tears streaming down their faces. She kept going, drinking in every word of encouragement and hoped the villagers threw her way, and May grinned so hard it lit up her face. Because she couldn't forget when Religious, Lilina, and Necro were sent to fight, or how May and his crew were told they were marching straight for the battle site. May choked out the truth in a sad whisper. Who could have guessed that the next hero, bearing his father's dreams and legacy, would ride straight into death's embrace only to be blasted with cries of betrayal and pelted with stones? Rain snapped an angry stare forward and demanded Marina wait for him. He would absolutely save her because he was already confident he'd win and nothing would ever be allowed to hurt Marina. Rain, the main character, strode through a shadow-choked corridor, and non-stop those wall-dwelling monsters kept crashing in, so he had to cut them down again and again. Yang really snapped that they were endless, like the barrage just kept rolling in over and over. Rain, the main character, swept through an evil crystal-covered monster with razor-sharp control and wiped it out completely. Dozens of monster eyes fixed on Rain, hungry to tear him apart and end him right there. Rain stared hard as monsters closed in all around him. Then he felt a monster lunging from behind, whipped around, and roared that he was drawing a magic blade. Rain ripped the monster in two with a lightning cutter, splitting it open like thunder itself had struck. Rain stared at the character and felt it in his bones. Too much mana was bleeding out than it should have been, and if that kept happening he'd get crushed in a real fight. So he put it together fast. That's exactly why Necro handed him this pendant. Right before Rain threw himself into the battle against the demons, he raced to Necro and begged for his advice. Rain marched up to him, and when Necro saw that, his shock burst out. "What are you doing here?" He blinked in total disbelief when rain suddenly poured over the city, then he shot back, "I'm heading out to save Marina." "Marina?" Necro begged him. "Please, I want to save Marina." The guy snapped back to Rain that he was only asking for forgiveness, but he wouldn't let it happen. Rain's eyes widened in shock at him. Necro warned that the underground dungeons are packed with countless monsters, turned people among them, and every single one is a monster in their own right, with some so far beyond the rest they feel like a different world. Necro warned that letting an inexperienced outsider in would be a total disaster. Rage blazing, Reino snapped that Marina was waiting to be saved, and that he had no choice but to go get her. Necro told Religus, "I talk straight to you just like that," then promised, "I'll hand it over only when it's a make or break moment." Rain, the protagonist, snapped back asking what Necro was planning and exactly how it would save him. Necro strode up to Rain and slapped his hand on Rain's shoulder, grinning as he revealed that it held magic, teleporting up to 7 people at once, then warned that if they shattered it, they'd be dumped right back at the entrance, and finished by laying out the advice he wanted to pass on. The boy locked eyes with Rain and demanded he listen close, while Necro shoved the truth into his head, "Come back alive no matter what." Rain stared at the arena, swallowed by endless sand, and told Necro, "Don't worry, everything's going to be fine." Necro grinned and said that this was the answer of a true hero's son. Then Rain slipped into a pitch-black corridor packed with monsters. Rain, shoulder aching and all, slumped against the wall, convinced this was the worst place to be, and then he gritted his teeth. He couldn't stop, not if he wanted to make it in time. He clutched his wounded shoulder and forced himself forward, thinking through heavy breaths that demons were real, and so were the monsters. If he kept this up, he'd burn through his mana and stamina long before he ever reached Marina. Rain burst into the huge hall, froze for a second at what he saw, then snapped, "The path's clear." Finally, he could rest because exhaustion already crushed him. Rain stepped into the room and froze. There it was, a crystal throne gleaming in front of him, and Loput was sitting on it. She shot him a look full of disdain and snapped, "You finally showed up," because she'd been waiting on him for forever. She leapt off her throne, but her tiny frame nearly sent her tumbling. Loput wobbled left and right in a clumsy slip, and that ruined the whole majestic act. Still, she lifted her chin to the rain like a dare and declared proudly, "I'm Loput, and I'm here to kill him," sounding so certain it felt like victory was already locked in. Loput clutched her growling stomach and strode up to Rain, whining that she'd been waiting forever and finally decided to slaughter a few monsters in these dungeons, because the fights had left her starving. Rain stared at her in shock, thinking, "You don't look like some demon who's about to kill me." Rain stared as the lipid groaned in hunger, and a cold, familiar gut feeling told him this wasn't the first time it happened. This scene played out just like when Karen asked him, or anyone, for food, because Rain yanked 2 chicken legs from his backpack and asked Loput what she thought about a snack, and the girl lit up, grabbed them, and devoured them in a rush. Lopez grinned and insisted he was nothing like a bad guy at all, while the girl's stomach growled. She shoved the whole piece into her mouth and tried to swallow it in one go, and Rain, the main character, stared in shock because she was so much like Karen. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that a Karen twin even existed in the world, and that revelation hit him hard. He didn't want a second Karen. Loput happily tore into the meat Rain had given her, chewing away like she'd just been handed a treasure, and Rain just kept watching for a bit, no rush at all to end the feast. Rain spun around and headed for the door, telling her to keep eating and not stall, because he had to press on. He prayed he could slip past without a fight, but Lopez suddenly lunged in and yanked Rain by the collar, and she still didn't stop chewing. Rain froze in shock, thinking he'd already escaped the danger, and Lopez snapped that he couldn't buy her off with a single piece of meat. Then Rain whipped his hands up in front of her face, trying to calm her down before this exploded. Rain blurted out that none of this was right and he couldn't just swing a sword at a girl. Loput listened, eyes locked on him, while Loput had already eaten every last bite of meat and was now just gripping the bone, grinning like an idiot. Then Loput asked what he meant. Rain and Loput went back and forth, and Loput finally insisted Rain was right. She was super nice and there was nothing he could do about it, but he should have understood something. The girl pulled a terrifying face just to scare Rain, and Loput snapped at him with pure fury, "Underestimate her and you could die," because hearing Rain call her weak lit her up with offense. Rain bolted out of Loput's grip like lightning, not believing she could be this terrifying. Rage burned in his chest as he realized the whole room had gone awful, and he still had to fight, no excuses. Just when he locked eyes with her, Loput vanished, and then, right in front of him, she wasn't there. The words were still ringing. She'd told him she'd definitely kill him. Before he could even process the shock, Loput reappeared behind Rain and her leg came up for a brutal kick. Something terrible was coming. Rain snapped around instantly to face her. Shock ripped through him, her speed was unreal. Lo slipped and grabbed hit Rain's hand, but he still dropped his sword as the strike hit the girl with brutal force. Rain yanked at his arm and pain exploded so hard he couldn't even breathe. She'd aimed right, no way she could miss because Loput was way too fast. Then the girl flashed a huge grin and roared that this was only the start of their fight. This time she swung her fist straight for Rain, determined to cripple him for good and steal the win. Rain barely slipped the first fist at the last second, but Loput wasn't done yet. She swung again for his head and Rain saw it coming, dodging it effortlessly. Loput went for a kick, but Rain lunged in and slammed the attack down. Then Rain fought to block every single blow, yet a few still landed. Loput stayed in non-stop motion, never giving Rain even one breath to catch up, and Rain raged in her head, realizing just how brutal that demon is, because Loput's way too fast to stop. Lopez threw everything she had into that punch, but Rain didn't see it coming, so he never got the chance to brace himself. Rain got slammed in the chest, so brutal it knocked the wind out of him and threw him clean off his feet, sending him flying several meters away, while Loput's power was terrifyingly strong even if her appearance didn't give it away. Rain came flying straight into the wall, but instead of the hard impact he crumpled into something soft. And as he shot through the air, he blasted the whole hall with dust clouds until it finally clicked, then he felt hands on him. Rain snapped his gaze upward in shock. Lilina was right there, having saved him, warning him it was dangerous, and Rain couldn't believe she'd truly shown up just like this. Rain bolted backward from her and barked loud and sharp, "What are you doing here?" Later, Lilina pushed herself up from the ground, said that her comrades had sent for her, shook the dust off her clothes, and started telling her story. Lilina said that the road ahead was packed with traps, so they had to split up. Then Karen triggered them and Lilina couldn't spot it in the dark. Rain, clutching his wounded hand, complained of a pounding headache and told Lilina they had to find them fast. Lilina sprinted over, refused to let him get up, and insisted he needed to recover while they bought time, because after the fight with Lopet she was terrified for Rain's condition. Lilina stared at Karen and the dog they'd dragged into the dungeon with them. Then Karen lunged forward and yelled at her to hold her back. Karen flashed a wide grin and said she should be trusted with this, no questions. Karen strode up to Lopez and there it was, clear as day. Those girls looked like sisters, same height, same build, and Rain's comparison was spot on. They stared at each other for a few tense seconds. Lo leaned in toward Karen's face and grinned, saying she'd be taken down by some slave and a dog with 0 mana. Karen snapped back hotly, asking if they were serious. Loput leaned in, stared Karen down, and grinned so wide it hurt, then asked, "So you're really walking around in these awful clothes?" And his smile twisted as he added, "You've got 0 taste." Karen clenched the hammer's handle and snapped, furious that these clothes were a gift from Rain, the main character. Karen didn't dare say it out loud. She swung the hammer with everything she had, but Loput snapped aside like it was nothing. The girl clearly didn't expect a real fight, yet she juked the hit at the last second, only for the hammer to snag her clothes and rip them wide open. Lopez snatched the torn cloth piece, screamed that her clothes were a birthday gift from her father, her precious treasures, and dared anyone to try tearing them. Karen snapped in rage, screaming that if she really mattered to her, then she'd better get exactly what she deserved. She charged up to the crystal pile and slammed it with everything she had. Crystal shards tore through the air straight for Loput. Loput burst into fast action, snapped an angry shout at Karen, and hit back so hard. What is she even trying to do? She's coming straight to get her dirty, and Karen. Girl looked completely stunned, because she never expected Karen to fight like that. Karen stood beside the dog, jabbed at Loput and shrieked, "Dontero, tear into him." Dontero snapped into a fighting stance, then froze, refusing to move an inch. Karen snatched him by the collar and sobbed, telling him Dontero had promised he'd do his best today, then declared it was time. Dontero refused to listen to her and shoved her away with his paws like he'd rather bite fate than move. Meanwhile, Loput's cheeks flared as she longed to pet him because she was totally smitten. She even told Karen her dog was worthless, but all she could think about was touching him, and soon she started closing the distance. Before anyone could stop her, she ended up standing on him and reaching her hands toward Dantaro. Then Karen let out a thrilled scream. Gotcha! Karen seized Laput by the hem of her dress, and Laput blinked at Karen in shock, asking what she was doing right now. Karen yanked low up, jammed a full dress over her head, then tied it in a tight bow so the girl couldn't wriggle free, before Karen started tickling her, aiming to teach her a hard lesson. Karen burst into loud laughter and yelled that this is exactly what happens when Dantaro distracts everyone. Then Laput started hopping in place, clawing to get free, and screamed that it was downright mean. She started yanking at the knot on her wrists, fighting to break free because she was ready to prove she could. Laput erupted in a scream, swearing that kind of knot couldn't hold her. Karen just grinned, stepped right up to Laput and taunted her as if she owned the moment. "These are my favorite clothes," she purred, vicious and teasing, "and if you push too hard they'll rip, got it? These were a gift from my beloved dad for my birthday." Karen grabbed a stick and started jabbing at Laput, cackling as it happened, while Laput snapped in rage and screamed for her to stop, and the dog just spun in circles around the girls. Lilina and Rain watched as Karen bragged that she wasn't going to be beaten, saying Rain and her couldn't match her arena tricks. But Rain stared, stunned, and blurted that this wasn't competition at all, it was just mockery. Lilput groaned that she'd spill the dungeon's secrets, she just needed them to untie her, and Karen tilted her head like, "So what secrets are you gonna try to dish out?" Laput snapped that traps were laid here to keep the monsters from clawing their way up to the surface. Then the girl went quiet, stepped onto a tile, and Laput blew up in rage, screaming that of course she'd been part of it too. The tile vanished under Rhine and he dropped like a stone. Then the exact same thing hit Lilina right after. And then Karen and Dantaro showed up. Laput bounced up and down in pure joy, screaming that this was exactly what they needed, because Laput never loses. She edged aside, tapped one tile, and it crumbled. Then a hole yawned open beneath Laput, swallowing her whole as she shot down into it, gasping, "I didn't expect this, not now." Rain was already soaring downward, clueless that this was the very bottom of the hole Laput had tossed him into. His stomach dropped as panic screamed that a trap waited here too, and he had to think of an answer fast. Rain snatched the sword, swore it was hopeless, but there was nothing else he could do, so the guy rammed the blade into the wall and used it like a foothold to keep from slamming down. Rain prayed everything would be fine, then grabbed the wall with white-knuckled hands just to stay upright. He crashed down with a massive slam, but somehow he walked away totally unhurt, because he managed to stop his fall at the last second. Rain lay sprawled on the ground, buried in sand and scattered bricks, and with one heavy breath he forced himself up, muttering that he was lucky he didn't fully crash. Suddenly, Rain shot his head up and there was Mia, staring right at him. They froze, shocked, like two magnets snapping apart, and Rain couldn't even find words because he never dreamed she'd be here. Rain hauled himself up off the floor and blurted, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to show up like this." He claimed he'd fallen here by accident, then hesitated as Mew said nothing. "It's not like I didn't notice," Rain added, "but I'll keep it quiet that you're a girl." Mew just smiled sweetly and said it meant nothing. She shrieked that he'd pay for this right now, and Mew slammed Rain down with her magic. The guy screamed too, stunned by what hit him as he crumpled to the ground. Rain clutched his bruised face and snapped out that he was sorry, no need to get mad. Then the guy demanded, "So what are you doing here, Mew?" Mew's anger flared as her furious dad had hauled her back home, and she shot back, "What did you just ask me?" When the girl went on, Mew exploded that the troublemaker who always strolled with her dog had triggered the traps and she'd slammed right into them. "Tell me," Mew said, seething, "who did it?" Rain only stammered an awkward, "I'm sorry, it's just that I didn't expect Karen to pull this." Rain, our main character, asked me, eyes sharp, why she was waiting here for help, and the girl shot back fast that he was wrong. She'd been hunting for a way out ever since, but nothing worked yet. Rain spun around, scanning the corridors in shock, and demanded, "Where are we now?" Mew snapped back that this was a concentration chamber. Dozens of twisted, elongated cages dangled all around them. Rain, trembling with dread, blurted, "Why are we even here? Did all this really mean monsters?" Mew stared him down, letting the silence stretch for his next question, then shook her head and pointed at the rack of tools, like this was all meant for people, not beasts. She stepped toward the human body, and in the blink of an eye, it shattered into crystal. She swore she recognized that girl, the one who was taken in such a cruel, brutal way. She met her when she was still tiny, and they even played side by side. Mew swore that the girl could make a flower bloom with magic the moment she cried. She also heard the girl had to quit school because of illness, yet nobody expected she'd end up here. Rain, the main character, erupted in anger and demanded how anyone could snatch a sweet child and haul her into this dungeon. Then he paused and muttered that maybe this was the only way out after all. Mew's voice cracked as she admitted she had no clue what was happening. Then she rushed over, yanked the shackles off her hands, and stared at the girl with heartbreaking sadness for a few seconds before telling Rain, "That's exactly why we have to grind at the academy. We can't let this nightmare happen to the other kids." Mew stared at Ray and asked if he was really ready to save Marina, then warned him she wouldn't blame Marina if she turned him down. After all, he looked absolutely crushed. At first, Rain tried to object, but then he swallowed his words, exhaled, and admitted she was totally right. Mew pushed herself up, turned her back on the girl who used to make her laugh, and told Rain that if it came down to it, she wouldn't mind becoming his. Rain, the main character, cut in on Mia and screamed, "They're attacking you from behind." Then he charged straight to her to jump in and help. Mew whipped her head back, gasping as the wall shattered into tiny pieces. Yep, the attack was back, and this time they were going to have to fight for real. Tirth, perched on the shattered wall, declared that the invaders had to be wiped out, then stared hard at the wall fragments slick with Rain, watching every beat between them and Mia. She stared ahead in shock and blurted, "You're still alive." Mew was sprawled in Rain's arms and she instantly turned betrayed, embarrassed, because this was the first time she'd ever landed in a moment like this. Rain shot Tirth a stern glare and demanded to know why she'd done all of this, while he completely ignored the mortified Mia, because all he cared about was one thing, that she wasn't hurt. Tirth sneered that Religious's son was a total idiot, then turned cold, focused on one mission: wipe out every invader, no excuses, no delays, and nothing would stop her. Tirth stared at Rain and Mia and said there was no point in trying to save Mia, while Rain, totally lost, demanded to know what she meant. The girl said, deadpan and cold, "This is just a warning, I'll betray you anyway," and the main character named. Rain and Mew stared at her, shocked to the core. Neither of them saw those words coming. Then Mew snapped and screamed in rage, "Why would I betray Rain? I'd never do that." And somehow, Rain of all people actually believed her, refusing to expect any cruelty from Mew as Tirth shot back, "You're nothing but a slave to one of the noble families." They rounded up child slaves no matter their race: rabbits, sheep, dogs, and a whole zoo of others. The girl kept insisting that if they really pushed themselves, their mom would even pull them into a hug, like the most incredible feeling on earth, because those hugs meant everything. Tirth said that for kids who'd lost their parents, this was the biggest prize imaginable, because for them, their mother was pure divinity and they'd do anything just to never, ever let her down. The girl snapped that since all of this was how things had to be done, she obeyed every order too, through misery, with grime on her hands and in the worst way possible, trying non-stop every single day to make everyone happy. Tirth said that the moment she felt weak and useless, they didn't hesitate, she was tossed aside like nothing at all. They blasted her as useless trash, staring with icy indifference like her feelings didn't matter at all. Then the girl said a woman crushed the hand of a child begging for help, stepping down with a brutal heel and not lifting off until a raw wound opened on the girl's hand. Tirth warned that for the sake of power, these people would use even children like tools. Griffin Bell is who she really is. Rain and Mew stared at her in total shock because they never saw this kind of story coming. Mew stared at Rain, fear bubbling in her eyes, and insisted it wasn't true, she didn't do it, while Rain just stood there giving zero reaction, lost in his own thoughts about how to handle this story. Tirth shot Mia a glare and demanded to know what she just messed up. Then Mia cut him off, straight up saying she'd come here for her own benefit. Miyu was mid-sentence when Tirth burst in, booming that she was dead wrong, none of it was true. Miyu's mind snapped to certainty, it had to be a lie because there was no way her family would ever do something like that. Mew erupted in furious screams at Tirth, insisting her father only wanted to crush the chaos as fast as possible, and she was certain he had nothing but good intentions in sending her. Tater leaned in and asked Miyu if they wanted to be the face that stopped the riots. Then Miyu snapped back with a furious scream, begging it wasn't what they wanted at all. Mew grabbed her clothes and held on so tight it hurt, snapping that she was seriously worried about Riene, while Tirth shot back that she was lying again. Then she barked that she just wanted to earn his trust like her own father did because he managed to win Religus over and worshipped him like the hero who saved them all. Tirth explained that when everything shifted, her father didn't just bow, he kissed the demon's shoes to grab the highest title, then shoved Religus out of the capital and all the way to the outskirts, and Mew's father did the same with Jade's shoes for pure status. He figured it would save his family, met him in the abandoned city, and carried out every single thing Jade demanded. Rain, now he finally said it out loud, looked at Mayu and everything clicked. Mayu just froze in pure horror because she couldn't accept that her father could actually do something like this, someone she'd always believed was good. Then Rain shoved his hand up between them, stared straight at Tirth, and declared with total confidence that Mayu was nothing like that. His face screamed that he was absolutely sure. Rain leaned in and told Tirth the truth. Mew had paid a huge price to act like her father's son so he wouldn't have to face shame, and sure, everyone stared at her nonstop, but Mew never once clocked the simple fact. She was a girl. Rain kept insisting that Mew kept shielding him day after day, because she was the hero of her own family, until Mew stared at him in shock like, "No, don't you dare," and Rain snapped back, yelling that she'd battled alone her whole life and shouldn't be dragged into a comparison with her father. While Mew's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands clenching as she thought she wasn't anything like Rain. Then she screamed that Rain had stopped. She stormed up to him and clung to him with all her might, her gratitude spilling over as she realized what kind of man he truly was. Mew pressed her face into his neck, tears spilling as she confessed that he seeing her that way meant everything to her, and she was honestly shaken that Rain, the main character, stepped in and defended her in front of Loput. Then she swallowed hard and said she was begging for forgiveness, but he insisted she was wrong. Mew inched right up to Rain and snapped that he didn't really know her, because her whole life had been ruled by her father's orders and saying it hurt. She told him she only realized this after meeting him, and her stubbornness wasn't pride at all, it was pure envy of his hero title. Then she gripped Rain's shoulders tight and confessed she was green with jealousy over Marina, who just openly declared her feelings. Mew's eyes said it all, she was terrified Marina loved Rain. Even though the dorm situation had her fuming a little, she couldn't hide how thrilled she was that he finally uncovered her secret, the one she'd guarded for years. Mew said she'd managed to show up in front of him at last, dressed as a girl, and then she blushed hard, confessing, "I love you." The girl jerked back hard and locked eyes with Rain. He melted into Mew's arms and basically dozed off, eyes shut tight. Then Mew grabbed his shoulders and started shaking. She couldn't believe it. All this time he hadn't been listening at all, he'd just been sleeping. Mew finally steadied herself, fuming because she thought he'd only been sleeping. And then she realized it was her hugs that knocked him out cold, because the girl listened to him breathing and even swore he was snoring too, so what was she supposed to do with him now? Mew forced herself to breathe, then stared hard at the Rain like it was hiding a secret. She figured Marina meant, "Don't come near me when he's asleep," and the fear in that thought made her realize it could get seriously bad. Marina snapped to Mayu that his behavior was spiraling out of control. Rain was still asleep for real, and yet out of nowhere he lunged, grabbed Mayu and crushed her in a tight hug. Mayu froze in shock and Marina wasn't lying. Rain suddenly snapped his head up and locked eyes with Tirth. She'd been watching the whole conversation like she'd seen every word. Tirth wasn't trying to start a fight, she just wanted to hear Mia and Rain. Then Rain simply let Mia drop to the ground. What happened to you?" the girl gasped in shock. Rain didn't answer at all, his eyes stayed shut but his body kept moving like something else was driving him. Tirth instantly felt it, the whole room's vibe had flipped. Rain bolts forward out of nowhere, then starts springing onto the wall around the girl, eyes wide as she watches him close and fast, right toward her. Later she snapped her head back and saw Rain, the main character, slam to a stop, and Tirth's stomach dropped because his moves looked totally off, nothing like what she'd witnessed in the arena. Rain sprinted right up to her and snatched her, then yanked at her clothes until Tirth shrieked, warning him to stop or he'd tear everything off, while she screamed that he might finally uncover her secret. Rain kept mocking her, and Tirth finally roared that he was about to uncover everything. She wouldn't let this happen, no matter what, she had to bury every secret. Rain, the main character, pressed a finger to her ear and Tirth screamed as electricity tore through her veins, shock after shock after shock, yet it didn't hurt a single bit. Tirth shrieked, lightning tore open the sky with a thunderous rift, and Rain, our protagonist, dropped her hard onto the ground. The girl stopped fighting, she couldn't even stay on her feet, let alone beat Rain. Then the guy snapped back to his senses at last. Rain, the main character, spun around in shock and demanded to know what just happened, because when he'd been under Sleep's control, he couldn't remember a thing. Rain stared at Tirth and blared, "You blacked out," then demanded why her clothes were torn while Miu leaned in and chirped, "Good morning, sleepwalker." Rain hurried up to Miu and with a shaky voice begged her not to clock him again this time. Miu glanced at Tirth and flatly said no, like the world's rules were crooked and she could feel it. Rain grabbed a blanket and threw it over Tirth, who still wasn't coming to her senses, and he blurted that, no matter what, they still managed to knock out a demon. Then he told Miu she was his lucky charm, and Miu awkwardly muttered that it felt like she was only getting in the way. Jade slipped in behind Miu with a grin and told her if that's what she wanted, she should just die right here, quietly, where no one would notice and no one would cry. Then he yanked out his scythe and swung straight for her. Miu whipped her head around in shock, demanding what was happening, and the next second a spray of blood tore through the dungeon walls and floor. That blood was Miu's at all, it was Jade's right from his own veins. He didn't even get a chance to lay a finger on Mia. Lin burst in just in time and snatched her to safety, and he couldn't stand the idea of anything happening to that girl. She snapped at Jade, swearing she'd never let Mia die, especially not at the hands of a demon, and then she drove her spear straight into the man's hand, catching him completely off guard. Lin snatched the terrified Mia with one hand while the other stayed locked on the spear still buried in the demon. She spun around to see Millily closing in and Lin roared, "This is my turn." Millily looked straight at her, slammed a hand to the ground, and unleashed a terrifying scream, calling on the majestic earth to harden into a spear and shred the enemies. Mallory let out a brutal scream, demanding the earth summon its needles. Then stone spikes erupted from the ground, towering and razor-sharp, and Mallory prayed they'd be enough to crush the enemies. Lin's hands trembled as she grabbed Miu's shoulders, and she blurted out, asking if Miu was really okay now. The girl dropped her gaze to the floor and with a weary sigh admitted that yeah, everything was fine with her. Rain bolted up to Millel and blurted, "How do you feel right now?" And the guy warned her that if she kept tossing magic like that, her mana could dry up fast. Millie grinned and swore there was nothing to fear. Mi had stitched up her wounds, so she was totally fine, and Rains, the main guy, just stared at her for a few stunned seconds. Rain let out a breath, told Mallory, "If that's how it is, then fine," and then Rain says to Lin, "You and me approach Mallory." He stared them down and said, voice full of gratitude, that they'd saved him, so he couldn't thank them enough. Jade scooped up Tirth, still out cold, flashed a grin at Rain and said the field shield saved them. He'd brought Tirth back safely. Rain glared at the demon and snapped, "When the heck was I supposed to have time for this?" Turns out he'd been setting this up from the very start. He slapped his hand over the girl's eyes and barked for them to stay careful, and he's convinced Jade is up to something shady. Then Rain, the main guy, snapped that this is the first time he's ever heard of demons teaming up to help each other. Jade stared him down and asked, "That revenue doesn't come out of nowhere. Do you really think there aren't this many people behind it?" Jade grinned, traced the earth with her fingers and said that as long as she stayed off, he could touch her as much as he wanted, while Rain, the protagonist, stared in shock, demanding if that was really his motive. Jade told Rain, "From where we stand, it's always the same people who refuse to step in when it matters." The man pushed for it. He told Rain to go through the exact same ordeal, so tell me, is that really true? Jade snapped that humans are brutal, selfish monsters, humanity's worst enemies, who unleashed a terrifying catastrophe, and yet humans still crown them as rulers. They swallowed their pride, picked temporary peace, and let the hero worship run wild. Jade kept insisting that day was the day they crowned themselves rulers again, and swore the demons would tear down the old world and rebuild it. The man demanded to know what those terrified people were doing. Jade didn't wait for a reply, he cut in and said it himself. When rage takes over, they aim it at the real hero, lash out at him so they can hide from their own anger, and the weak, they grovel at the feet of the strong. Jade said that's just how people are. They don't rebel against the enemy at all, they turn on their own neighbor and hit first. Our so-called hero betrayed us, nobody saw it coming, not after just one sentence hit the crowd like a bomb. Jade snapped his head toward the newcomer, Maggot. The demon grinned and praised him for a job well done, and the whole room froze in shock. Rage flared in Rain's eyes as he demanded, "What are you doing here?" Jade claimed it was all because of him that they pulled in everyone's attention, so Maggot stared at the floor, frozen, not knowing how to answer. Then he barked back, "Me, you think I'm the one?" You asked the guy what he did. Right before the ceremony, he just happened to catch Mr. Jade's words. Maggot swore Jade was bragging that Caddy's the great disaster would be reborn and come crashing down to wipe out the greatest heroes. Maggot chose to protect Mr. Mia, then kept pushing that claim, so he slid right into Mr. Jade's plan during the event, blasting leaflets that the heroes were traitors. But Rain exploded with rage, yelling that Jade was tricking everyone who couldn't see through him, and Maggot shot back to shut up because Rain was the real traitor, the one deceiving Mr. Mia. So Maggot demanded what Rain was up to, because if Rain hadn't been there, none of this chaos would have happened. Jade strode up to the guy and clamped a hand on his neck, then grinned as he spewed the truth. The hero's son was behind it all. He snarled that Rain had stolen beloved Mia from him, and the man kept nodding, repeating it like a demon's chant. Then Jade unleashed crystals, driving them straight into the Maggot's body. Jade snapped, "Who's supposed to pay for the sin?" And then boom, it was Cadis's turn. Maggot swelled into a monstrous chimera, and Jade grinned so hard it looked painful as he said, "I guess you love your gift." Then he leaned in and declared, "You're not a man anymore, you're a chimera." Jade settled Tarth in a safer hold, then started to slip away. Right before he left, he muttered that he was sorry but they had to go. Then he froze and beamed, saying, "For sure." And told Rain he had a special gift just for him. But the guy couldn't so much as budge, and Rain, the main character, let out a scream when she realized it was a barrier. Meanwhile, Jade grinned like crazy. The man warned him not to lay a finger on them. This barrier drinks mana dry, so chasing them would be a fatal mistake, and right then a monster surged up behind Miu, Lin, and Millie. Jade snapped at Rain. Either hand over his little friends to get torn apart, or cut down that maggot and save them. Rain, the main character, slammed into the barrier and went for broke, then roared to his friends that he'd finally help them now. Miu shot back with calm confidence, telling him to hold his strength back to save Marina. Meanwhile, the girl stared down the monster and told Rain to step aside and let her handle the enemy, because Maggot was her friend. She closed the distance and stared straight into the guy's empty eyes. Miu snapped in rage that she was one of the great dukes. No way was she letting him slip away, and as his friend, she'd spare him the kind of suffering the demon had already cursed him with. The monster said he owed it all to Mr. Miu, and the moment those words hit, a killer thirst burned to life inside him. Maggot slammed into Mia, but she juked out of the way. Then he yanked his fist back and snapped in bitter disappointment that she wasn't here. Lin leapt sky high and drove her spear straight into the monster, and Maggot crumpled to the ground under the impact. Lin snapped her head toward Miu and Millie, then screamed at full volume that they had to move, right now. Millie and Miu stood shoulder to shoulder, shot their hands up and unleashed their moves. Miu screamed that she was summoning an all-cutting vacuum blade, while Millie vowed she'd drive the strongest sand spear straight through the enemy. Magic collided with the world, and out of nowhere, a raging sandstorm tore through everything. A monster got yanked around in a furious hurricane of sand, and Lin sprang back to stand beside the girls. Miu burst out, thrilled that they nailed it. Millie muttered that nobody could possibly survive a hit like that. Miu stood frozen in shock, staring at the monster that was still somehow whole. Then Maggot leaned in with a grin and asked, like it was no big deal, what it even was. He glared at the girls and snapped that this was all the scholarship students could manage. Then Maggot stepped in, grinning, saying, "My turn now," and ordering Mr. Miu to keep a sharp eye on him before the monster slammed down a mud prison. Maggot grinned and claimed it was some top-tier magic that stripped your clothes and pinned your movements down. Then he leaned in and asked if he was way cooler than Shiro, right? The monster stared at Mia and demanded to know what the master would do next, while Maggot realized with a jolt that Mia wasn't a monster at all, she was a girl. Miu snapped at him, telling him not to look at her right now. Maggot flashed a huge grin and spat, furious and certain that everything finally clicked for him. This was exactly the whole point. She should have told him immediately, no delays, no hiding it. Maggot suddenly barreled toward Malillian Lin, blaring that he was about to have fun, and the monster started taunting the girls to laugh. Then he snapped his head to Rain and yelled that the main character needed to watch closely, because now he was using slaves. Lin erupted into an angry scream, begging the monster to stop, then kept yelling with pure fury, warning him not to touch them with those filthy hands. Maggot snapped with rage and told Lin that the slaves weren't allowed to speak, then ordered her to say nothing at all. Maggot snapped at Lin not to challenge the nobleman, then slammed a stone hand down on her and squeezed harder and harder until pain lit up her whole body. The monster sneered that Lin was a filthy, ill-mannered slave. Maggot shuffled over to Miu and plopped his head on her shoulder, laughing as he said that a slave's education is all up to his master. Maggot pushed Miu, asking if he was right. Then it all slammed back when his plan to fix the rad went sideways, and he couldn't forget the brutal scolding his father laid on him right after. Maggot started pressing up against Mia, bit by bit. He told her, "Then Mrs. Miu, you're going to face it yourself." Miu stared at the monster, terror freezing her in place. Maggot leaned in and asked the girl how she'd scream, and Caddis was desperate to hear it too. The monster started taunting the girl, and it set out to ruin her day in every possible way. Rain heard you scream and listened, then Maggot burst out laughing and demanded what he'd even heard. The monster snapped its gaze on Rain and roared that his friend was in trouble, but did Rain really know? Maggot cracked up and said he was stuck, like, what could he even do without his sword? Rain, main character, gripped the sword's hilt and yanked it free as he stared down the monster, shouting that he had a sword. Since he's a magical swordsman, he swings his blade and shatters the demon's barrier meant to trap him. Maggot screamed in fury that it meant nothing, then kept touching Mia just to make Rain snap, while the monster demanded what he was trying to say, like it could do something awful to him, and Maggot shot back that he was nothing but a useless son of a hero. The monster never saw Rain as a real threat, so Rain seized the moment and sprinted straight at it, ready to rescue the girls. Maggot snapped furious, asking if Rain was even hearing him, warning that one wrong move would make Miss Miu pay. Rain fired back, raging, insisting everything was fine, and that he'd end it with a single blow. Maggot had no time to breathe. He clung to Mia with all he had as the monster froze at the shock of how fast Rain was. Then the guy slammed his fist into the creature's stone body with everything he'd got, shattering its crystals into jagged shards while Maggot roared in panic, because he never thought this monster could actually be beaten. Rain stared at him and realized it wasn't him that had awakened at all. It was the darkness seed a demon planted deep in his heart. Rain smashed the demon's soul itself, then he sucked in a shaky, tired breath as the stone prison crumbled and Lin, Mallory and Miyu were finally free. Rain rushed to them and the guy blurted excitedly, "You're okay?" Everyone was safe, not a single soul harmed. Lin spun away from him and snapped that they were fine, but that monster had torn their clothes to shreds. Then Mallory's cheeks flared red as shame hit her hard. Lin stared at the guy sprawled out cold, then snapped at Rain, asking if Maggot was truly dead, and Rain, our main character, rushed over and checked him for injuries. Rain told Lin, "I'm fine, yeah, I blacked out but nothing happened to me." And just then the earth ripped itself open under their feet as the ground started roaring with shaking, the kind that makes you scream. Rain's rage burst out. "What else is supposed to happen? Is this some demon trap again?" Mallory dropped to the ground, slammed her palm down and blurted, "These tremors are the price of earth magic." Rain, exhausted, shot back, "So what does that even mean? How is that possible? We're just getting swallowed by trouble after trouble." Just when the heroes hit the ground, it vanished under them. Everyone dropped, flailing with nothing to grab, and Rain, furious, roared, "I knew it." Before he snapped, "These problems can't end with Megiddo." Rain snapped his eyes to Mia as she tumbled beside him, then blurted, "How deep is this dungeon?" Mia shot back, annoyed, "I don't know." Just as they dropped, a blinding light burst up from the pit below, so bright it didn't make sense. Rain stared in shock. They weren't supposed to be this close to anything alive, so why was it glowing like daytime? Rain and the girls surged toward the light, and the scream hit the air when the truth appeared. 3 silhouettes, a blazing sun overhead, and suddenly the dungeon didn't look like a dungeon anymore. The dungeon sat way above the city, and we crashed down into the forest that hugged the castle and the houses, slamming through endless corridors over and over, but Marina was nowhere to be found.